Hello there, and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where big ideas settle in softly, strange creatures get a closer look, and the natural world becomes just a little more unsettling in the most relaxing way possible. Tonight, we're easing into a question that sounds as though it escaped from a museum display, slid through a jungle documentary, and decided to wait for us by the riverbank. What if Titanoboa were still alive today? Now, that is not a small question. It is not even a medium-sized question. It is the sort of question that arrives with a very large body attached to it. Because Titanoboa was not just any snake. It was a snake so enormous that even modern pythons and anacondas begin to look less like rulers of the swamp and more like enthusiastic understudies. It belonged to a world of deep heat, thick wetlands, and oversized creatures, and for a long time, that seemed like a very comforting fact. Titanoboa lived then. We live now. The ages were neatly separated. The giant prehistoric serpent remained tucked away in the fossil record where it could do no harm except to the nerves of anyone with a healthy respect for reptiles. But imagine, just for a moment, that the separation never happened. Imagine that somewhere in the long, tangled history of life on Earth, Titanoboa did not vanish. It endured, it adapted, it stayed hidden when it needed to, it spread when conditions suited it, and instead of existing only in bones and reconstructions, it remained part of the modern world, breathing in the steam of tropical wetlands, moving through rivers that now carry cargo ships, and sharing a planet with highways, satellites, fishing boats, and us. That changes the mood rather quickly, does it not? There is something about giant snakes that presses a very old button in the human mind. People who are perfectly calm around lions in documentaries, sharks in tanks, or even rather alarming spiders in jars will still go a bit quiet when the subject turns to a very large serpent in murky water. Perhaps it is the silence of them. Perhaps it is the way they move without the usual courtesy of announcing themselves. A bear, at the very least, often has the decency to look like a bear from a distance. A giant snake can look like a log, a shadow, a ripple, or a patch of dark water behaving in a slightly suspicious way. And Titanoboa would not be merely large in the casual sense people use when describing a dog that jumps on guests, or a pumpkin entered into a local fair. Titanoboa was enormous in a way that forces the brain to do some extra work. This was an animal estimated to have reached lengths of around 40 feet or more, with a body so thick that calling it snake-shaped almost feels too simple. It would not slither past like a quick ribbon through grass. It would move like a living piece of heavy machinery that happened to prefer swamps. So tonight, we are not just asking whether such an animal could survive in our world. We are asking what our world would become if it did. How would people live in regions where a predator like that still existed? Which places would belong to it? What would it eat? Would it remain rare and hidden, known only to a few unlucky fishermen and very tense biologists in rubber boots? Or would it become one of those facts of life everyone in certain parts of the world grows up with, right alongside monsoon seasons, flood warnings, and being told not to go near the reeds after dusk? Before we settle in properly, I would love for you to take a small glance at your own corner of the world. Where are you listening from tonight, and what is the hour where you are? Perhaps it is late, and the room is quiet. Perhaps rain is ticking against the window. Perhaps the house has gone still, and this is the part of the night where the mind begins to wander into strange territory. A topic like this suits that hour rather well. One enormous snake, one modern planet, and a question large enough to wrap around both. And if this gentle expedition into oversized reptiles, deep time, and mildly alarming wildlife management turns out to be a soothing place for your thoughts to settle, I would be very grateful if you liked the video, subscribed, and stayed with the channel. It helps this quiet little space reach more people who enjoy drifting off to the sort of questions that begin with natural history and end somewhere between science, imagination, and a slightly firmer grip on the blanket. Now, with that said, let us move carefully into the thought experiment. The first thing worth noticing is that the idea feels impossible only because we are used to the present arrangement of life. Our world seems normal to us because it is the one we know. We expect elephants, but not mammoths. Crocodiles, but not something from a distant age that looks as though evolution briefly forgot its usual sense of proportion. We accept whales because they are familiar, even though a creature the size of a building swimming through the sea ought to be the sort of thing that sounds invented. Familiarity is very powerful. It smooths the rough edges off reality. It takes the extraordinary and files it down into everyday background. If Titanoboa were still alive today, children in some parts of the world might grow up drawing it the way others draw sharks or wolves. Warning signs might feature its silhouette. Local news might occasionally report sightings with the same tired voice used for floods, landslides, and escaped livestock. Wildlife officers might discuss habitat encroachment, with grave expressions, while someone in the comments insisted it was all the fault of tourists and another person swore their uncle had seen one 20 years earlier, and no one listened. In other words, the impossible can become ordinary very quickly once enough generations live beside it. That is one of the most useful ways to begin thinking about this. Not as a monster dropped clumsily into the modern world for dramatic effect, but as an animal with a place in it. A very large place, admittedly. A place with muddy banks and heavy air and birds that go quiet all at once. But still a place. Because the truth is that living things, even frightening ones, do not usually behave like movie villains. They do not wake each day with a desire to trouble a nearby village purely for narrative momentum. They behave like animals. They seek shelter, conserve energy, find mates, avoid injury, and eat when it is worth the risk. That remains true whether the animal in question is a fox in a hedgerow, or a snake so large that describing it as somewhat concerning begins to feel inadequate. It helps, too, to remember that the modern world already contains reptiles with a talent for humbling human confidence. Saltwater crocodiles still patrol estuaries. Large constrictor snakes still move through tropical forests. Komodo dragons still exist with their stern expressions and impressive bite. And humans, being humans, continue to build roads, resorts, and fishing docks near all of them. We do not merely survive dangerous animals, we normalise them. We write safety brochures about them. We give them protected status, warning labels, local legends, hashtags, and occasionally themed gift shops. So the real question is not whether Titanoboa would shock the modern world. It would, at first. The more interesting question is how quickly the shock would wear off and be replaced by routine. Because routine is how people live with almost anything. Perhaps in certain tropical river systems, people would learn to read water differently. Not all stillness would mean safety. Not every floating branch would be trusted. Children might be taught early how to recognise trails in the mud, how to avoid nesting zones, how to tell the difference between ordinary ripples and the slower, heavier disturbance made by something with real mass behind it. Boat design might change in some regions. Fishing schedules might change. Waterfront development would certainly become a far more nervous business meeting. There would be practical adjustments. There always are. That, in a way, is what makes this topic so interesting. It is easy to picture the first reaction to a living Titanoboa. Fear is straightforward. Fear arrives on time and requires no invitation. But after fear comes paperwork, adaptation, policy, engineering, folklore, and all the other very human attempts to make room for danger, without giving up the land entirely. We are a species that has looked at floodplains, volcanoes, storm coasts and bear country, and said, more or less, yes, but the view is excellent. There is no reason to think giant prehistoric snake country would defeat that impulse. It would merely complicate insurance. Of course, Titanoboa also carries a special kind of unease because it sits at the intersection of two things that tend to stir people deeply. The first is size. The second is survival. We are unsettled by animals that are much larger than our instincts feel prepared for, and we are fascinated by anything ancient that manages to keep going. It makes the world feel less tidy. We like the past neatly labelled and shelved. We prefer extinct creatures to stay extinct because extinction while tragic, is at least organised. A living Titanoboa would be disorganised in the most dramatic possible way. It would force the ancient world back into the present tense. And that would not only affect people who live near it would affect the global imagination. Titanoboa would appear in documentaries, news cycles, school books, political debates, conservation campaigns, and low-budget films with titles that make very strong promises. Scientists would study it with intense seriousness. Tourists would ignore excellent advice regarding safe distances. Conspiracy forums would immediately produce grainy footage of objects that were definitely either a Titanoboa, a hose, or an unusually emotional tree root. Social media would have a truly dreadful time with it. Yet beneath all that noise sits a simpler and more grounded question. What sort of animal was Titanoboa really? And what would that mean if it had lasted into our age? To answer that properly, we have to strip away some of the usual habits of imagination. Giant snakes in fiction tend to behave like scaled train wrecks with opinions. Real animals are constrained by muscle, heat, habitat, prey availability, reproduction, and energy budgets. Even very large predators spend much of their time not doing anything dramatic at all. They rest, they wait, they conserve. Movement is expensive, risk is expensive, failure is expensive. The larger the body, the more that matters. So if Titanoboa were alive today, it would not spend its days charging around the countryside in a permanent state of reptilian ambition. It would choose its environments carefully. It would rely on ambush. It would be tied to warmth. It would need enough food to justify its size, but not in the absurd way people often imagine. Like many large predators, it would probably live a life built around patience more than pursuit. That, in some respects, makes it more believable and more unnerving. A noisy creature announces itself. A patient one lets the world come close. And here is where the thought experiment begins to feel less like fantasy and more like ecology. A creature does not exist alone. It shapes and is shaped by everything around it. If Titanoboa were still here, wetlands might be managed differently. Large herbivores in some regions might behave differently. Other predators might avoid certain waterways. Human settlement patterns in flood-prone tropical zones might bear the marks of centuries spent giving certain channels a wide berth. Perhaps some rivers would be known less by their depth or navigability than by whether they were heavy snake water, the sort of local phrase that sounds almost casual until an outsider asks what it means. People create language around risk. It makes danger easier to carry. There would also be culture around it, because there is always culture around powerful animals. Songs, warnings, folk tales, carved images, regional sayings, children being told not to wander alone, older fishermen insisting the young have lost respect for the river. In some places, Titanoboa might be feared, in others, respected. In still others, protected reluctantly by governments trying to balance biodiversity with the very understandable concerns of people who would prefer not to share a marsh with something capable of treating a canoe as an inconvenience. And then there is the problem of scale, which is best introduced gently because it has a habit of sneaking up on the mind. People hear giant snake and think long. Length matters, yes, but mass changes the picture. Titanoboa was not just stretched out. It was thick, powerful, and built for a world that gave it the heat needed to support such a body. To imagine it alive now is not simply to picture a bigger anaconda, it is to imagine an animal that would dominate space in a way most modern terrestrial predators do not. A tiger is formidable, a crocodile is formidable. Titanoboa would be formidable and difficult to mentally file away. It would resist becoming background wildlife, even where it was rare. This is why the question stays with people, not because it is only scary, but because it pulls together so many threads at once. Deep history, climate, predation, human adaptation, the stubbornness of life, the possibility that the modern world, for all its screens and engines and satellites, could still contain one enormous old rule from another age. Do not stand too close to the water. That rule, interestingly enough, would not be new. Humans have lived with it in many forms for a very long time. We tend to think of ourselves as separate from the older logic of the wild, but that logic remains surprisingly active. Swamps still have residents, rivers still conceal things, dense vegetation still rewards caution. We have technology, yes, but technology does not remove biology. It simply changes the way the encounter unfolds. A drone can scan a marsh, a thermal camera can detect heat, a warning system can alert nearby communities. None of that makes a giant predator fictional. It merely makes us better at filling out reports after spotting one. There is also a useful humility in this idea. The present world can feel so managed, so measured, so thoroughly mapped that it is easy to forget how much of life still answers to older rules. A living Titanoboa would be a reminder that modernity is not the same thing as control. It would tell us that airports and phone towers can coexist with deep, ancient danger, that progress does not erase habitat, that wilderness does not need our permission to remain wilderness. It only needs enough heat, enough cover, and enough living things to feed on. If that sounds a little uncomfortable, that is probably because it should. A world with Titanoboa in it would be more interesting, yes, but also less relaxed. Some landscapes would recover a certain authority. They would no longer be places people entered casually. They would be negotiated spaces, shared spaces, if one wished to sound optimistic. Contested spaces, if one had recently heard a very large splash. And still, for all that, there is something undeniably compelling about such a world. It would be richer in one very specific way, not safer, not simpler, but richer in the sense that it would contain one more reminder of how strange life on Earth has always been. The line between the prehistoric and the modern is not as emotionally stable as we like to pretend. Crocodiles already hint at that, sharks do too. Horseshoe crabs have been quietly embarrassing our timelines for ages. Titanoboa would simply make the point with considerably more force and a much lower profile in the water. So as we move further into this question, we should do so with two ideas in mind at once. First, Titanoboa was a real animal, not an invented beast. Second, if it were still alive, it would not just be a curiosity. It would be a pressure on landscapes, on human behaviour, on local economies, on conservation law, on fear, and on storytelling. It would change how some people lived every single day, even if most of the planet knew it only through screens and articles and the occasional unnerving headline. And that is where the ground beneath this thought experiment becomes firm enough to stand on. Because before we picture modern rivers with giant snakes in them, before we decide where such a creature would hide, what it would hunt, and how humanity would react the first time undeniable evidence reached the wider world, we need to step back into the older heat that made Titanoboa possible in the first place, and take a proper look at the animal itself, not as a monster, not as a myth, but as a real serpent from a real Earth that once existed, and that under the right conditions might not have been finished with us at all. To understand what it would mean for Titanoboa to still be alive today, we need to do something very useful before the imagination gets too enthusiastic. We need to slow down and look at the animal as it actually was, or at least as closely as science has been able to reconstruct it. Because once you strip away the dramatic music, the alarmed headlines, and the very natural tendency of the human brain to become unhelpfully theatrical around very large snakes, Titanoboa becomes even more interesting. Not less frightening, certainly, but more grounded, more specific, more real. Titanoboa was not invented by storytellers who wanted to frighten children away from marshes. It was a real prehistoric snake, known from fossils discovered in what is now Colombia. It lived around 58 to 60 million years ago, in the Paleocene, not terribly long after the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. That fact alone gives it a strange position in the mind. It did not belong to the age of tyrannosaurs or giant sauropods. It came after. The dinosaurs were gone. The world had already shifted. Mammals were beginning their long, important rise. Forests were changing. Heat and moisture still ruled many landscapes, and in that world, one of the most successful large predators was not a mammal at all, but a snake of astonishing size. That matters because it reminds us that evolution does not move in a straight line toward what feels familiar to us. It experiments, it enlarges, it simplifies, it revisits old designs and improves them when the environment allows. Titanoboa was one of those moments where the conditions lined up just right for something extreme. It was not a mistake, it was not an accident, it was a working animal built by selection, by opportunity, and by a climate warm enough to let a cold-blooded body grow to what now seems like a deeply inconsiderate length. And that climate is important. Reptiles do not generate body heat the way mammals do. They depend heavily on external temperatures, so when scientists discuss Titanoboa, they are not just talking about a giant snake. They are talking about a giant snake that tells us something about the world that made it possible. A body that large needed warmth, lots of it. The Paleocene tropics where Titanoboa lived were hotter than many comparable regions today. Wet, dense, and deeply productive, the environment offered heat, cover, and prey. In other words, it gave a giant constrictor exactly the sort of place it could make a living without having to apologize for existing. The image many people first form of Titanoboa is quite simple. They picture an anaconda, then mentally stretch it until their common sense objects. That is not a terrible place to begin, but it does miss something. Titanoboa was not simply longer than a modern giant snake. It was heavier in proportion, built for serious power. Estimates vary, as they often do with extinct animals, because fossils rarely arrive with a polite measuring guide attached. But researchers have suggested lengths exceeding 40 feet, and weights well over a ton in some cases. Even if future work nudged those estimates slightly one way or the other, the central fact would remain unchanged. This was a snake large enough to dominate its surroundings in a way few terrestrial predators ever do. And yet, size alone does not explain survival. A giant body can be impressive and still be a burden if the world around it changes too much. That is why, if we're asking what would happen if Titanoboa were still alive today, we're really asking a hidden question underneath the obvious one. What would have had to happen for it not to disappear? Because Titanoboa did disappear as far as the fossil record tells us, or rather, its lineage did not remain in that exact form. The world cooled, ecosystems shifted, the specific conditions that favoured a snake of that size no longer held in the same way. That is the neat version of the story, the usual version, the one in which time behaves properly and puts old things away. But our thought experiment asks us to disrupt that tidy ending. Suppose Titanoboa did not quite leave. Suppose it shrank in some places, endured in refuges, adapted behaviourally, found the hottest wetlands, tracked the most stable climates, and held on long enough for the modern world to arrive around it. That sort of persistence would not be unprecedented in the broad history of life. Many lineages have survived enormous upheaval by changing just enough and not too much. Crocodilians are an obvious example. Horseshoe crabs are another. Certain sharks have been making the same basic point for a very long time. The Earth is full of creatures that seem to say, in one form or another, this body plan still works. Survival does not always require novelty. Sometimes it requires stubbornness, flexibility, and the good sense to live where conditions stay favourable while other things go extinct around you. If Titanoboa had done that, it would not necessarily mean a single uninterrupted population of giant snakes gliding through every age untouched. That would be the more dramatic version, but not the most biologically convincing one. A better version is slower and more believable. Small populations surviving in warm, isolated river systems. Generations adapting to new prey. Range contractions and expansions with climate shifts. Occasional near disappearances. Local extinctions. Recolonizations. A long history of not being widespread but not being gone either. The ancient snake would not remain common. It would remain possible. That distinction matters because people often imagine survival as abundance. They think that if a huge predator were still alive, we would see it everywhere, hear about it constantly, and build half our towns around avoiding it. But many powerful animals live at low densities. They leave space between one individual and another. They require large territories or highly productive habitats. They are real without being common. In fact, rarity often helps large animals survive longer, especially if they are secretive and live in difficult terrain. A giant snake in open country would be exposed, noticed, and quickly drawn into conflict with humans. A giant snake in flooded forest, blackwater channels, swamp margins, and heavy tropical cover might remain out of sight far more often than our imaginations would like. That is one of the key things to understand about serpents, especially ambush constrictors. They are not built around spectacle. They are built around efficiency. Their best outcome is often to go completely unseen until the instant being seen no longer matters. A snake the size of Titanoboa would not need to announce itself. It would rely on stillness, concealment, and the simple advantage of occupying places humans do not move through comfortably. Deep mud, murky water, flooded brush, tangled root systems, overhanging banks, abandoned channels. The world still contains quite a few such places, and not all of them are routinely inspected by cheerful people with clipboards. There is another reason the idea of a surviving Titanoboa begins to feel less absurd the more closely you look at it. Fossil animals often seem emotionally distant because we know them only in fragments. A few vertebrae, a jaw, an impression in stone, enough to reconstruct but not enough to feel familiar. But Titanoboa belongs to a category of animal that still has living relatives large enough to keep the imagination honest. We know what giant constrictors are. We know how they move, how they hunt, how they conserve energy, how they use water, how they swallow prey whole, and then spend long periods digesting. Titanoboa was not an alien design. It was an amplified version of something that still exists. That continuity is important. It means the gap between the prehistoric and the modern is not as wide here as it might be with some other extinct animals. We do not need to invent its basic habits from scratch. We can infer quite a lot from living boas, pythons, and anacondas, with the usual caution that a bigger body changes the details. A great many extinct animals are hard to imagine behaving naturally. Titanoboa is easier. It would bask, hide, wait, strike, coil, rest, and digest. It would shed its skin. It would breed seasonally or in response to local conditions. It would avoid unnecessary risk. It would seek water, not because water is dramatic, but because water supports its mass and gives it a tremendous advantage in ambush. And that immediately makes one thing clear. If Titanoboa had survived, it would almost certainly have done so as a wetland specialist. Not necessarily aquatic in the same way as a crocodile, but strongly associated with rivers, swamps, oxbow lakes, marshes, and the thick margins between land and water where visibility drops and prey movement becomes predictable. A body that large benefits enormously from buoyancy. Water allows heavy animals to move with less effort. It cools them, conceals them, and expands their hunting options. If you were a giant constrictor trying to remain a giant constrictor in a changing world, you would stay close to the water and let the landscape do half the work. This also helps explain why such a creature, if it persisted, might not leave a constant record of itself in human history that everyone recognized clearly. Wetlands preserve mystery very well. They distort distances, they hide movement, they swallow remains, they make witnesses sound unreliable even when they are not. Human beings are also selective about what they believe, especially when confronted with reports that sound inconveniently large. Every culture has stories of oversized serpents, river monsters, and hidden things in reeds or dark channels. Most of those stories are not evidence of Titanoboa, of course. Folklore is not a fossil bed. But if a large relic species did survive in remote wet tropical habitats, it would not be entering a human world completely devoid of interpretive frameworks. People would have names for it long before scientists arrived with Latin and calipers, and that is where the phrase "never truly left" starts to feel useful. Not because the fossil record secretly says Titanoboa survived, it does not, but because in the human imagination, enormous serpents never really leave at all. They remain in myths, warnings, carvings, river stories, and local memory. We carry a template for them. We know what they represent: hidden danger, old places, low water, still air, a shape that does not belong and yet somehow does. The scientific Titanoboa and the cultural giant snake are not the same thing, but they overlap enough that if the animal had endured, its survival would have felt strangely familiar, as though something we had been half expecting all along had finally decided to show itself properly. Still, survival is not just a matter of hiding, it is a matter of reproduction. A species persists because enough individuals live long enough to breed, because young survive, because habitat remains connected, because food continues to exist, and because mortality does not overwhelm replacement. For Titanoboa to last into the present, all of those pieces would need to align again and again over millions of years. That is a demanding requirement. Large predators reproduce more slowly than small prey animals. They are vulnerable when young. They are vulnerable when habitats fragment. They are vulnerable when climates cool past a certain threshold. So if Titanoboa survived, it likely did so not as a triumphant ruler of every tropical river, but as a specialist hanging on in very favourable pockets. Those pockets would have to be warm, wet, prey-rich, and difficult. Difficult for humans to penetrate consistently, difficult for large-scale agriculture to fully erase, difficult even for competing predators to dominate. The great tropical wetlands of South America are the obvious candidates, though one can imagine similar refuges elsewhere in this thought experiment. The point is not merely that the animal needed wilderness, it needed the right kind of wilderness. Heat without long cold periods, water without too much seasonal collapse, enough large-bodied prey to make giant size worthwhile, enough concealment to make ambush hunting efficient, and perhaps most importantly, enough continuity through time that each generation did not begin with disaster. That kind of survival would shape the animal itself. A lineage that endured into the modern era might not be identical to the Titanoboa of the Paleocene fossil beds. It would still be Titanoboa in the broad sense of our scenario, but perhaps somewhat altered. Slightly smaller in some regions perhaps, more behaviourally cautious, more nocturnal where humans were present, more tied to water than its ancestors had been, better at disappearing during lean periods. Survival changes species, and not always in flashy ways. Sometimes it makes them quieter, harder to find, better at not announcing their existence until an unfortunate goat, deer, caiman, or very confused boar fails to arrive home. That thought also helps us avoid turning the animal into a cartoon. A relic Titanoboa would not be a prehistoric machine frozen in time. It would be a modern survivor with ancient roots. It would carry deep history in its bones, but it would also bear the marks of every age it endured. Ice ages at the margins of its range, river shifts, forest contractions, human arrival, fire, hunting pressure, habitat loss, the spread of boats, roads, and fences. It would, in other words, be ancient without being unchanged. That is a much more interesting creature than a fossil come to life. It would be an animal that had earned its place in the present. And if it had earned that place, people living near it would know it not as a museum concept, but as part of ordinary caution. There might be signs of it in settlement patterns going back centuries, villages placed a little farther from certain channels, seasonal avoidance of particular wetlands, rituals around crossings, strong opinions about where livestock should not be watered, stories told to children that outsiders dismiss as exaggerated until they notice the way adults also avoid the same stretch of bank after sunset. In this version of the world, Titanoboa would not just be a biological fact, it would be local knowledge. There is something else worth noticing here. Modern people tend to divide animals into neat emotional categories: cute, dangerous, useful, endangered, pest, sacred, edible, protected. A living Titanoboa would ruin these categories in the most inconvenient way. It would be dangerous, yes, but also scientifically priceless, threatening, but perhaps rare, feared by nearby communities, but defended by conservationists, a creature likely to trigger both emergency policy meetings and academic delight in equal measure. One person's nightmare would be another person's grant proposal. Human responses to powerful animals are rarely consistent. They are layered, argumentative, and often conducted by people who live comfortably far away from the actual bite, crush, or splash zone. That means the survival of Titanoboa would also produce arguments about belonging. If a giant snake kills livestock, is it a menace or a native predator reclaiming habitat? If it appears near a settlement, should it be relocated, monitored, protected, or removed? If it is critically endangered, how much risk should nearby communities be expected to tolerate for the sake of preserving a lineage older than most mountain ranges in their present form? Those are very modern questions, but they would rest on a very ancient body. And that, perhaps more than anything, is why the idea feels so gripping. A surviving Titanoboa would compress time. It would place a Paleocene design into modern politics, modern fear, modern land use, and modern technology. It would remind us that the past does not always vanish cleanly. Sometimes it lingers in forms that continue to press on the present, not like ghosts, not like symbols, but like muscle and scales and appetite. The ancient snake would not be a memory. It would be there, breathing quietly in a reed bed while a drone passed overhead and a cargo plane crossed the sky. Once you picture that clearly, the next question arrives almost on its own. Not whether Titanoboa could feel ancient to us. It would. Not whether it would inspire stories. It certainly would. The next question is more immediate, more physical, and in some ways more unsettling. If such a snake had survived all the way into our age, just how large would it really feel in the modern world, standing beside the animals, vehicles, houses, roads, and people we use to judge scale now? Because there is a difference between reading a measurement and sensing what that measurement means, and Titanoboa is one of those creatures that only becomes fully alarming when the numbers stop being numbers and start becoming space. That is the point where the imagination usually begins to misbehave. A number on a page sounds manageable for a few seconds, and then the mind quietly files it away under very large, and moves on without doing the harder work. 40 feet. 42 feet. Perhaps more in some estimates. Over a ton in weight. Thick as a grown man's torso and then some. These are facts that sound impressive in the abstract, but abstraction is generous. It softens things. It gives us distance. The modern world is full of measurements, and most of us live among them without really feeling them. We hear that a bridge is a certain length, a truck weighs a certain amount, a room is a certain number of feet wide, and unless we stand beside it, we never fully absorb what those figures mean. Titanoboa would suffer from that problem immediately. People would hear the measurements and picture something large, certainly, but still somehow manageable inside the imagination. A big snake. A very big snake. Perhaps a longer anaconda, something one could still mentally arrange into familiar categories. But scale does not work that way once the body gets beyond a certain threshold. At that point, size stops being a matter of exaggeration and becomes a matter of presence. The animal no longer feels like a larger version of a thing you know. It feels like a thing that changes the space around it. And that is the most important word here, space. If Titanoboa were still alive today, its size would not register first as biology. It would register as occupation. It would occupy riverbanks differently. It would occupy camera frames differently. It would occupy roads, boats, marsh channels, and the human nervous system differently. Standing near evidence of it, even before seeing the whole animal, people would feel scale through consequences. a flattened patch of reeds that was too broad, a drag mark in mud that looked less like a trail and more like something had pulled a soaked tree trunk into the water, a section of bank where the grass did not merely bend but seemed pressed down by weight. The environment would begin translating the animal long before the eye managed to take it in properly. That matters because human beings are not especially good at reading scale when shape becomes unfamiliar. We do quite well with buildings, cars, furniture, dogs, cattle, and other things that belong to our ordinary size library. We do less well with creatures that are unusually long, unusually thick, and unusually low to the ground. A giraffe is tall, and so the brain understands it quickly. An elephant is massive, and the eye can take its bulk in because the shape rises clearly above the landscape. A giant snake is trickier. It stretches, it curves, it disappears into vegetation. It presents only part of itself at a time. One section looks possible, another section looks odd, and by the time the full body is mentally assembled, the conclusion arrives rather late and with very poor timing. This is why Titanoboa in the modern world would feel larger than its measurements suggest, not because the measurements are wrong, but because the body plan makes them deceptive. A 40-foot mammal would be impossible to misread. A 40-foot snake to give you 12 feet of visible body, a section underwater, another part looped in reeds, and a head that did not immediately appear enormous because it was not shaped like the head of a mammal built to advertise itself. The result would be a very modern kind of disbelief. People would see footage and insist the camera angle was misleading. They would stand beside a shed skin or a body impression and say it looked edited. They would need reference points. And once those reference points arrived, the mood would shift. Imagine the length of a small city bus, except alive, muscular, and able to place that length wherever terrain allowed. Imagine a body that could extend along the side of a car, continue past it, and still have a great deal left to explain. Imagine something that could lie partly concealed in roadside drainage, with enough body hidden that the visible section alone would already be larger than the biggest snake most people believe they might one day encounter outside a documentary. That is when the scale becomes real. Not when it is spoken, but when it is set against objects built for human life. A good way to understand how Titanoboa would feel in the present is to compare it not only to animals, but to human spaces. How much room does something require in a yard, on a dock, beside a house, under a bridge, in a canal, along a levee? Length matters, but thickness is what gives the body authority. A python may be long, an anaconda may be very heavy. Titanoboa would push further into the category where the body seems less like an elongated animal and more like a moving piece of loaded industrial hose wrapped in living muscle. If part of it crossed a narrow road, drivers would not feel they had seen a snake. They would feel they had come upon an event. This is also why photographs would be oddly unsatisfying at first. Cameras flatten. They remove depth. They compress distance. A big animal close to the lens can look fake. A big animal far from the lens can look unimpressive. With Titanoboa, many early images would probably fail to convince half the audience. One section of body in a muddy channel, a head lifting above water, a broad coil in low brush, until a person appeared in the same frame, or a boat, or a known stretch of guardrail, the image would not settle into the mind correctly. Then it would, and from that point onward most people would never again be entirely comfortable with the phrase, just a snake. It would also feel large because modern people think in terms of mobility. How quickly can it move? How far can it reach? What does its size allow it to do in relation to me, to a fence, to a doorway, to a canoe, to the edge of the water? We do not merely perceive size, we perceive potential. A house cat can leap farther than many people expect, but it remains emotionally manageable because it is small. A crocodile feels larger than it is in part because its motion suggests force. Titanoboa would combine the two distortions. Its mass would suggest terrible strength, and its movement would not need to be fast to feel decisive. A body that large advancing even steadily through shallow water would create the sort of visual information that makes onlookers step back before they have fully processed why. There would be another complication, and it would happen in every country where Titanoboa lived. People would underestimate it by splitting the animal into sections. This is something the eye naturally does with long bodies. It sees the head first, then a stretch of trunk, then perhaps a coil, then tail if one is lucky or unlucky enough to receive the full tour. But a long constrictor is not several impressive pieces, it is one connected engine. The power is distributed. The force does not sit in obvious limbs or shoulders the way it does in a bear, a lion or a horse. It runs through the whole body. So a modern viewer might briefly think, the head is not as large as I expected, and then make the serious error of forgetting that the rest of the animal is essentially the weapon. The head itself would produce a peculiar reaction. People often assume a giant snake must have a comically giant head, like something designed by a nervous illustrator. But large constrictors do not always scale up in the way fear would prefer. The head can look less dramatic than the body deserves. That mismatch would make Titanoboa seem strangely wrong to modern eyes. The width of the body would announce enormous power. The head, unless seen very closely, might look almost modest by comparison. That is unsettling in its own way. It gives the animal a kind of efficiency, as though nothing has been wasted on display. It would not need horns, height, or dramatic posture. It would simply be a tremendous amount of serpent arranged with awful practicality. Set beside modern snakes, Titanoboa would push past the point where comparison remains comfortable. Reticulated pythons and green anacondas already occupy the upper edge of what many people can accept without adjusting their breathing. Titanoboa would not merely beat them in length or mass, it would change the category. If the biggest modern constrictors feel like the heavyweights of the reptile world, Titanoboa would feel like a heavyweight from another age entering the ring after everyone else has already gone home and the lights are being switched off. The relation would not be one of simple increment. It would feel disproportionate. That disproportion would become clearest around water. On land, a giant snake is impressive because land is full of reference points. Trees, roads, vehicles, walls, fences. But in water, especially dark or vegetated water, scale becomes slippery. You see less, and so you imagine more, which in this case would often still be an underestimation. A section of body rolling just beneath the surface would create a wake wider than seems reasonable. A crossing animal in a river channel might resemble debris at first, then a floating trunk, then something impossible, and only after that a snake. That sequence matters. It would mean encounters often began with confusion, not immediate recognition. Recognition would come second, and with it, a much worse feeling. A modern fishing boat would help make the point. Not a cargo vessel, not something grand and cinematic, but an ordinary small working boat with an outboard motor, coolers, fuel tanks, wet rope, and the smell of river mud and old fish. Place Titanoboa beside that. Not attacking, not thrashing, simply surfacing nearby or sliding past in the same channel. Suddenly the size becomes unacceptable in the most practical way. The boat would no longer feel like a sufficient unit of human confidence. People feel very differently about large animals once the animal can plausibly interact with the entire craft rather than just the people in it. A shark can threaten those aboard while remaining in its own medium. Titanoboa, being a constrictor associated with margins, would make the edge itself feel compromised. Shore and boat, boat and water, water and reeds. The boundaries would become less reassuring. Its thickness would likely be what people remembered most after a genuine encounter. Length is easy to report and easy to distort. One person says 20 feet, another says 40. A third has a cousin who insists on 60, because family storytelling remains one of our oldest traditions. But thickness is harder to dismiss because it collides with expectation. A snake body thicker than a man's thigh is impressive. Thicker than a waist is another matter. Titanoboa would carry the kind of mass that forces the witness to update all assumptions about what constriction means. This would not feel like an oversized rope. It would feel like a body built to pin, wrap, brace and overpower using sheer contact pressure spread across astonishing muscle. And still, for all that, the most disturbing part might be how low it all remains. A giraffe gives you the dignity of height. A rhinoceros stands visibly in its own bulk. Titanoboa would bring gigantic scale close to the ground, close to the mud, close to the root line, close to the lip of the bank where human legs and animal legs alike are least graceful. That makes large size feel more personal. It sits where steps are taken. It inhabits the same narrow corridors through brush and marsh that many creatures use to reach water. In effect, it would put enormous mass into exactly the places where visibility is worst and decisions are quickest. That is why even a dead specimen, or a museum reconstruction based on a recently deceased individual in this imagined modern world, would likely affect people more strongly than expected. Museums already do this with large animals. Whale skeletons are too big for the mind until you stand beneath them. Dinosaur halls work because the body enters your scale directly. Titanoboa would do something similar, but with a closer and less forgiving body plan. Visitors would not stand beneath legs or wings or ribs high overhead. They would stand beside an animal whose entire design says contact, reach, and closeness. Children would either be delighted or cling to an adult with very firm principles. Adults would take photos containing their own feet for reference, as though the feet might help. There would also be the modern media effect, which makes size stranger rather than clearer. One viral video of a Titanoboa sliding under a bridge would circulate endlessly, and half the audience would still argue over whether it was real. Scale in the age of screens has become oddly negotiable. We trust nothing at first. We accuse everything of editing. But once enough angles arrive, enough eyewitness accounts, enough government statements, enough drone footage with measurement overlays, disbelief would give way to a different modern response. Obsessive comparison. People would compare Titanoboa to SUVs, corridors, swimming pools, stairwells, trains, sports courts, and all the other standard objects through which the internet now processes reality. This would be helpful in a way. It would also be dreadful. There is a reason everyday comparisons work so well here. We do not live among Paleocene prey. We live among parking spaces, docks, drainage canals, culverts, chicken coops, fences, farm gates, and utility tracks. To say Titanoboa could span such and such a number of feet tells part of the story. To say that a body like that could occupy a suburban lane, or lie coiled beneath a cluster of mangroves with enough mass left hidden to change the waterline around it tells much more. Modern people would not fear Titanoboa because of a number in a paper. They would fear it because it would fit into the world in all the wrong ways. Even its stillness would feel large. That may sound odd, but it is true of big ambush predators generally. A still crocodile feels more substantial than a moving deer, because the stillness implies control rather than absence. Titanoboa, resting in heat, or waiting by a crossing point, would not need to move much to dominate the scene. The body would lie with the kind of confidence that comes from not needing to prove anything quickly. This would make every encounter feel slightly delayed, as if the realization lagged behind the sight. First you see shape, then mass, then meaning. By the time the meaning arrives, your body has already begun stepping back. It would also feel large relative to human certainty. That is an important dimension of scale which is not usually measured. Some animals feel bigger than they are because they unsettle what we think a landscape permits. A moose on a road at night can feel enormous partly because the road seems like our space until it is not. A great white shark feels enormous because it converts the open sea into someone else's territory. Titanoboa would do that to wetlands, riverbanks, floodplains, and any place where vegetation and water cooperate against clear sight. It would enlarge the environment by making parts of it morally farther away. 100 yards of reeds is not much on a map. It becomes much more when something that size can be inside it without difficulty. People living near it would adapt, of course. That always happens. They would grow up with a more accurate sense of the animal's scale than outsiders ever had. They would know how wide a track had to be before concern was appropriate. They would know what portion of a surfaced body suggested the rest was nearby. They would know that large and close are not interchangeable, and that a great deal of trouble begins when a visitor mistakes one for the other. Locals would become the quiet experts in realism, while the rest of the world exaggerated, minimised, sensationalised and sold themed shirts. And yet even they, the people most used to Titanoboa, would not be casual about its size. Familiarity does not erase mass. It simply teaches respect in smaller daily doses. One does not stop regarding a flood as large because one lives on a river. One becomes better at reading signs, better at preparing, less theatrical about the danger, but no less aware of what it can do. Titanoboa would work the same way. In regions where it lived, size would become part of practical knowledge. Boat length compared with known individuals, safe bank height in flood season, fence design for livestock enclosures, the dimensions of culverts that should not be treated as trivial. Every one of those measures would be an acknowledgement of how large the animal actually felt once human life had to account for it. That is the real answer then. Titanoboa in the modern world would not feel large merely because it was long or heavy or unusual. It would feel large because it would press against the scale of everyday life from every direction, against roads, boats, cameras, fences, doorways, shorelines, and nerves. It would make modern things look temporary and human plans look somewhat optimistic. It would not resemble a serpent that had grown too big. It would resemble a part of the old earth that had remained big while everything around it changed. And once that size is properly felt, another fact settles in right behind it. A body like that cannot live just anywhere. It would need the right heat, the right cover, the right water, and the right silence. Which means the next thing to consider is not simply how immense Titanoboa would appear, but where in the present world such an animal could still make a home without immediately being seen, hunted, fenced out, or starved. The answer, at least if we want to keep one foot in biology and avoid wandering too far into monster fiction, is that Titanoboa would not live everywhere people fear it might. That is one of the first comforts the mind reaches for when dealing with a creature like this. Enormous animals tend to feel unlimited in the imagination. They seem capable of appearing in any dark corner, any stretch of river, any patch of reeds with the vague confidence of a nightmare that has ignored the local climate report. Real animals are much less flexible than that. They have requirements, they have limits. They do not simply go where the story would like them to be. They go where the temperature is right, where the cover is good, where enough prey moves through, and where staying alive does not cost more energy than the habitat can provide. For Titanoboa, that would narrow the map very quickly. A snake that size would almost certainly belong to heat first, water second, and concealment third, though all three would matter so much that separating them is mostly a convenience for discussion. Titanoboa was a giant constrictor from a very warm world. If it had survived into the present, it would still be tied to places that offer a reliable supply of external warmth. It would not be thriving in temperate forests. It would not be gliding cheerfully through chilly mountain valleys. It would not be making a respectable life for itself anywhere that winter expected animals to prepare for frost. A body that large, built on reptilian rules, needs long periods of warmth to function well, digest efficiently, reproduce successfully, and move with authority rather than reluctance. In practical terms, that means the modern home of Titanoboa would almost certainly be restricted to tropical and possibly near equatorial regions, where cold is rare, brief, or absent altogether. Even that is only the first filter. Warm air alone would not be enough. Titanoboa would want wet landscapes, not merely because large constrictors often favour water, but because water makes giant size more manageable. A body weighing that much benefits from buoyancy. Water supports mass, allows stealth, moderates temperature, and creates natural funnels for prey movement. The edge between land and water is one of the most productive and least polite places in nature. Things come to drink there, to cross there, to graze nearby, to nest, to wallow, to move between feeding grounds. It is full of routine, and predators adore routine. If Titanoboa were still alive, it would almost certainly be a master of that edge. Not purely aquatic, not permanently submerged, but deeply devoted to the sort of habitat where mud, roots, reeds, still pools, side channels and overhanging banks do half the hunting before the animal even begins. That brings us very quickly to the obvious region. If Titanoboa survived from its known ancient range in what is now northern South America, then the likeliest place for it to still exist today would be the great tropical lowlands of that continent, especially the Amazon basin, the Orinoco basin, associated swamp forests, seasonally flooded forests, oxbow lakes, backwaters, marshlands, and the enormous network of river systems that already support some of the most formidable reptiles on Earth. This is not because South America is automatically the home of every unsettling thing with scales, though the continent has certainly done its part over the years. It is because the ecological ingredients line up there in a way that makes sense. Heat, heavy rainfall, endless wetlands, thick vegetation, abundant prey, difficult visibility, and large areas where human access remains uneven or seasonally limited. If one were designing a modern refuge for an ancient giant constrictor, the draft would begin there. The Amazon in particular would not simply be a backdrop. It would be a machine for hiding large life. People sometimes speak of the Amazon as though it were one enormous forest and leave it there, but in reality it is a vast mosaic of habitats, many of them flooded for part of the year, many difficult to survey thoroughly, many changing with water level, sediment, rainfall and season. There are whitewater rivers carrying heavy sediment, blackwater systems dark as steeped tea, seasonally flooded forests where trunks stand in still water for months, floating meadows, swampy margins, abandoned channels, and countless pockets where a very large animal could remain far less visible than city imaginations would assume. It is one thing to say that modern technology can find anything. It is another to maintain that confidence in a place where water, canopy and distance collaborate so enthusiastically against certainty. A living Titanoboa would likely be most at home in exactly those messy in-between places, not in fast open channels where large boats and constant visibility would make concealment difficult, and not in dry uplands where its size would become a burden, but in low, hot, tangled habitats where moving slowly is normal, where mud accepts weight, where water hides outline, and where prey must eventually pass. Oxbow lakes would be excellent. Flooded forest margins would be excellent. Swampy side channels cut off from heavy traffic would be excellent. Stretches of marsh with limited human use would be even better. The animal would not require untouched wilderness in the romantic sense. It would require enough neglected difficulty to be left alone most of the time. That is an important distinction, because many dangerous animals survive not in pristine isolation, but in landscapes humans have only partially managed. We like to imagine a clean division between civilization and wilderness, but real maps are full of blurred edges. Logging roads stop, farms give way to marsh, fishing camps sit beside long empty channels, settlements occupy dry rises while floodplains remain half wild for practical reasons. A surviving Titanoboa would exploit those blurred edges ruthlessly, though not out of malice, simply out of animal competence. It would live where the land remains inconvenient enough that people never fully flatten it into order. One can take this further. Beyond the Amazon proper, the Orinoco floodplains would also make sense, especially the llanos during wet seasons, though a giant snake that large would need to use the changing landscape carefully. Seasonal flooding can create extraordinary prey opportunities, but it also alters concealment and movement. Some regions would be favourable only at certain times of year. Titanoboa would likely learn the calendar of water very well. It would know when channels deepen, when mammals shift to higher ground, when nesting colonies gather, when fish become concentrated, when dry season pools trap life in smaller spaces, and when breeding opportunities arise for the snake itself. Such an animal would not merely inhabit a wetland, it would inhabit the timing of that wetland. The Pantanal also enters the conversation almost immediately, and for good reason. It is one of the largest tropical wetland systems on Earth, seasonally inundated, rich in wildlife, warm, and already famous for supporting large reptiles, large fish, and the sort of ecological abundance that makes ambush predators feel very much at home. A Titanoboa population there would be alarming but plausible within our scenario. The Pantanal has open areas, yes, but also marshes, gallery forests, slow waters, and vast seasonal complexity. For a giant constrictor that can wait, hide, and move with the floods, it would be a remarkably generous address. Still, there are reasons to think Titanoboa, if alive today, might prefer more forested and visually complex habitats than the most open wetlands. Great size is impressive, but it also increases exposure. The larger the body, the more valuable shade, cover and broken terrain become. An animal that could remain half concealed beneath root tangles or submerged along dark banks would fare better than one forced into wide open shallows where birds, monkeys, caimans, boats, and eventually drones might all develop opinions about it. So while broad floodplains could form part of its range, the most secure long-term habitat would likely be the sort that combines water with visual clutter, thick riparian vegetation, flooded forest, mangrove margins in suitable tropical zones, peat swamps, labyrinthine marshlands, places where one could point at a map and say, with some humility, that looks difficult to check properly. And then there is the matter of temperature again, which keeps returning because biology keeps insisting on it. Titanoboa, as giant ectotherm, would need not merely warm days but a warm system overall. Cool nights, prolonged seasonal drops, or higher elevations would likely place real constraints on its size and activity. That means its range would probably be concentrated in lowland tropical areas and exclude places that look lush to a human traveller but are thermally unreliable from a reptile's point of view. The world contains many green places. Not all of them are equally kind to giant serpents. Mountains, even tropical mountains, would likely mark the edge of its comfort. Dry tropical forests might support occasional movement, but not ideal residence. Cooler subtropical wetlands might host wandering individuals during hot periods if the lineage adapted enough, but stable breeding populations would likely remain in the true hotlands. That limits the global map more than people might expect. Even in continents with large river systems, Titanoboa would not simply establish itself wherever water exists. It would need a particular balance. Southeast Asia, for instance, contains large constrictors, dense tropical forests and vast wetlands. One can imagine a world in which a Titanoboa-like lineage, had history unfolded differently, might have found a home in some of these habitats. But in the strictest version of our scenario, where the animal persists from its known South American past, the simplest and strongest answer remains the neotropics. South America would not just be where it began, it would remain where the present still most resembles the conditions that once let it become extraordinary. That said, animals do not always stay neatly within the borders scientists would prefer for them. Rivers connect, flood events relocate bodies, juveniles disperse, rare wanderers turn up in unexpected places. Human beings also move animals, sometimes deliberately, sometimes through negligence, and occasionally through decisions so baffling they deserve a separate museum wing. If Titanoboa were still alive today, there would always be nervous speculation about its possible spread into other suitable tropical habitats. Could an escaped or relocated individual survive elsewhere? Could isolated populations linger in coastal wetlands beyond the usual range? Could human modifications of waterways create new corridors or new conflict zones? These are exactly the sorts of questions wildlife authorities would be forced to answer while trying not to alarm the public more than necessary. Yet even with those possibilities, the core of its range would still be governed by habitat quality, not just climate alone. Consider what a giant constrictor needs on a daily basis: resting sites protected from overheating and disturbance, reliable access to water, basking opportunities that do not expose it too fully, ambush points with regular prey traffic, secure nesting or birthing areas depending on reproductive strategy, juvenile refuge zones where young snakes are not instantly converted into someone else's lunch. All of that must exist together, not as scattered features, but as a functioning landscape. It is not enough for a place to be hot and wet. It must also be structured in a way that supports a very large predator over generations. This is one reason truly massive animals often end up concentrated in habitat mosaics rather than uniform expanses. A single endless swamp might sound ideal in theory, but if it lacks nesting security, dry season refuge, prey diversity, or enough thermal variation for the animal to regulate itself, it may be less suitable than a mixed system of channels, forest patches, elevated banks, marsh edges, and flooded flats. Titanoboa would likely prefer areas where one could move, over the course of a year, between slightly different microhabitats without needing to leave the broader wetland altogether. In modern conservation language, we would call this landscape connectivity. In older and simpler terms, it means a giant snake likes options. Human settlement would shape this distribution too, though perhaps not in the way popular imagination expects. People often assume that a huge predator would retreat only to the most remote untouched regions, but many large animals survive in places that are not fully remote, merely hard to dominate. A Titanoboa population might persist near lightly used river corridors, around cattle country cut by wetlands, along the margins of protected reserves, or in broad flood zones where permanent settlement is limited by floods rather than fear of snakes. In such places, the snake would not need perfect isolation. It would only need enough habitat complexity and enough people willing to remain mostly elsewhere most of the time. Of course, where Titanoboa lived would also depend on where it was tolerated. That is an ecological reality too, though people sometimes prefer to pretend it is a separate matter. A large predator's distribution is shaped not only by food and climate, but by human patience. An animal that regularly appears near villages, boat landings, or livestock enclosures will experience conflict quickly. An animal that stays mostly within swamps, flooded forest, and difficult channels may provoke fear without immediate retaliation. Over generations, that difference becomes decisive. Titanoboa would likely survive longest in places where geography helps keep it inconveniently distant from everyday human routines, even if not truly far away in straight-line terms. So if one were to map its most probable modern strongholds, the pattern would likely look patchy rather than continuous. Core populations in the hottest, wettest, best covered lowland river systems of northern and central South America. Secondary pockets in major wetlands linked by suitable corridors. Rare outlying individuals in marginal areas during favourable seasons. No broad march across continents. No presence in every tropical postcard marsh. Just a network of serious habitats, each selected by a very old reptilian logic that cares nothing for national borders and very much for bank structure, water temperature, cover, and the daily movements of prey. There is also a useful point to make about cities and infrastructure. Titanoboa would not prefer them, but it would occasionally intersect with them wherever they press into wet country. Bridges over remote rivers, drainage canals near expanding towns, levees, hydroelectric reservoirs with vegetated margins, industrial river fronts that give way immediately to wild side channels, transport corridors through marsh. In these places, the snake would not be urban in any meaningful sense, just dragged into the orbit of human construction because humans have a habit of building across the exact places other animals were quietly using first. That would produce a certain kind of modern panic every time it happened, but it would not mean the species had become adaptable in the casual way raccoons or pigeons are adaptable. Titanoboa would remain a creature of serious wet habitat. It would simply be forced into contact whenever that habitat is sliced by human plans. One could imagine governments responding with maps, warning systems, and exclusion zones. Red areas during flood season, restrictions on night travel in specific channels, special protections around breeding habitat balanced awkwardly against community safety measures. Ecotourism operators would market safe observation zones, which would be both inevitable and a poor sign for someone's future decision-making. Fishermen would know certain creeks by reputation. Ranchers would clear banks more aggressively near stock watering points. Road engineers might modify culverts and embankments in regions where large constrictor movement is common. In this way, where Titanoboa lived would not remain only a question of geography, it would become a question of planning. Some places would be left less developed not out of scenic kindness, but because the resident wildlife had rendered enthusiasm expensive. And because this is still a giant snake, we should remember one final thing about habitat. The best place for Titanoboa would be the place least likely to show it to us clearly. That sounds almost unfair, but it follows naturally from the animal's design. It would do best where water is dark, plants are thick, shorelines are irregular, and visibility is limited to irritatingly short distances. A tiger can vanish in grass. Titanoboa would vanish in geography. It would not merely hide behind things, it would inhabit systems that hide everything larger than a dragonfly, unless it wishes to be seen. That is why so much of its modern range, even in this imagined world, would remain more talked about than witnessed. People would know where it lives in the broad sense. They would not often know exactly where one individual was, and that uncertainty would become part of the habitat itself. So the answer is not simply the jungle, though people would certainly say that, often with a helpful shiver. The real answer is the hottest wet lowlands, the great tropical river basins, the marshes, swamps, flooded forests, blackwater channels, oxbow lakes, and reed-heavy margins where giant size is supported, hidden, and made useful. Not everywhere warm, not every river, not every swamp, only the serious ones, the kind of landscapes that already ask for caution, where boots sink, engines sputter, birds go quiet without explaining themselves, and the line between land and water was never as firm as maps pretended. And once we know where such an animal would choose to live, the next part follows as neatly as footprints to a water's edge. Habitat always leads to appetite. A creature can only settle where the menu makes sense, and a snake that large would not remain ancient for long unless the modern world gave it enough things worth waiting for. Once we know where Titanoboa would live, the next question arrives with a certain nervous efficiency. What exactly would a snake like that eat in the modern world? Because it is one thing to imagine a giant prehistoric constrictor hidden in tropical wetlands. It is quite another to imagine what sort of menu would keep such an animal alive year after year, without turning every riverside settlement into a daily emergency bulletin. And as with so many questions about large predators, the truth is both less theatrical and more unsettling than the first dramatic version people tend to picture. A creature like Titanoboa would not hunt constantly. That is one of the first misconceptions worth setting aside. Large constrictors are not built for endless activity. They are not marathon pursuers or tireless stalkers in the mammalian style. They are creatures of patience, timing, and efficiency. When a snake reaches extreme size, movement becomes expensive, risk becomes more serious, and wasted effort becomes a luxury it cannot afford too often. So if Titanoboa were still alive today, it would almost certainly spend much of its life doing what many successful ambush predators do best: waiting, resting, conserving energy, letting the landscape present opportunities rather than rushing around in search of them. That sounds almost reassuring until one remembers that wetlands are full of creatures moving in predictable ways at predictable hours. They come to drink. They cross shallow margins. They nest along banks. They travel game trails pressed into mud by generations of hooves and feet and claws. They gather in the dry season near shrinking water. They bunch together in the breeding season. They move in and out of channels with the flood pulse. To an ambush hunter, all of that looks less like chaos and more like scheduling. Titanoboa, then, would not need to be a constant hunter to remain a very effective one. The first prey to consider are the animals already living in the kinds of habitats Titanoboa would likely favour. Capybaras would be high on the list in South America, and it is difficult to imagine a more fitting candidate. Large, semi-aquatic, social, fond of wetland margins, and blessed with the sort of calm body shape that seems to invite predators to form professional opinions. A modern Titanoboa would almost certainly take capybaras wherever ranges overlapped. The capybara is already prey for jaguars, caimans, anacondas, and humans, which is not an ideal record if one is trying to project confidence. Add a snake of Titanoboa's size, and the poor creature begins to resemble a recurring line item in the wetland food web. And yet, capybaras would probably not be the whole answer, nor even the main answer in every place. A predator that large would likely feed on a range of prey sizes depending on what was available, how often hunting opportunities presented themselves, and what degree of risk came with each attempt. That last part matters more than people often realise. Predators do not select prey solely by maximum possible size. They select prey by profit. What can be subdued without too much danger? What can be swallowed without injury? What can be digested efficiently? What can be found repeatedly enough to justify specialising on it? A very large snake is powerful, but it is also vulnerable in ways that popular imagination tends to ignore. Broken teeth, internal injury, overheating during a struggle, or a bad encounter with horns, antlers, hooves, or claws could all carry serious consequences. Titanoboa would not hunt like a reckless creature trying to impress a documentary narrator. It would hunt like an old and very practical machine that prefers outcomes it can survive. That means medium to large wetland mammals would likely form an important part of its diet. Young deer in floodplain forests, peccaries in vulnerable situations, tapirs in certain settings, especially juveniles or smaller individuals caught at awkward moments, wild pigs where they occurred, perhaps even marsh deer or similar animals depending on the exact region. Not every hunt would be grand. In fact, many would probably be surprisingly ordinary by predator standards. A young animal separated at the bank, a crossing at dusk, a trail used too often, a muddy edge where footing fails at exactly the wrong second. Ambush predators do not rely on prey being foolish. They rely on prey being routine. Waterbirds would likely matter too, especially in younger life stages of the snake, and perhaps even for adults when opportunities were easy enough. Large nesting colonies, ground nests near marsh edges, and birds that gather in concentration during certain seasons can provide abundant food with relatively low risk. Titanoboa would not be above taking such meals simply because they are not dramatic. Real predators are not insulted by convenience. If a giant snake could consume a large bird, a clutch of eggs, or a nestling-rich colony in times of need, it would. There is no rule in nature requiring a giant predator to choose the most cinematic option available. Fish would almost certainly play a role as well, though probably not in the romantic sea serpent living on fish alone sort of way. A snake of Titanoboa's size living in river systems and swampy wetlands would have many opportunities to take large fish, particularly in constricted waters, drying pools, spawning movements or floodplain bottlenecks, giant catfish, lungfish, rays in suitable habitats, perhaps even large armoured fishes where they occurred. Still, one suspects fish would be a supplement or a local specialty more than the backbone of the diet for the largest adults. Mammals and reptiles offer more concentrated returns for a constrictor capable of taking them. And then, of course, there are reptiles. A giant wetland snake in South America would almost certainly hunt caimans, especially juveniles and mid-sized individuals. Perhaps even large adults in the right circumstances, though that would involve genuine risk. This is one of the more unnerving aspects of Titanoboa in the modern world. It would not merely coexist with formidable reptilian predators, it would sometimes eat them. We already know that large snakes and crocodilian relatives can engage in a grim sort of ecological negotiation. The modern world contains enough examples of that to make one uneasy near water, even without adding another few thousand pounds of muscle. Titanoboa would extend that conversation in a particularly ancient direction. A caiman surfacing in a channel already represents a certain level of wetland authority. A snake, large enough to regard some caimans as prey rather than colleagues in the broader enterprise of alarming vertebrates, would alter the local hierarchy quite noticeably. The same would likely be true for large turtles, especially soft-shell or river turtles where shells, size and handling difficulty did not create too much trouble. Eggs and hatchlings would be obvious opportunities. Adult turtles might be taken selectively depending on species and local conditions. A giant constrictor is not the ideal shape for dealing with every shelled animal, but predators do not ignore concentrated protein simply because it has opinions about armour. Still, when people ask what Titanoboa would hunt now, what they usually mean is something a little more pointed. They are wondering whether it would hunt the larger modern mammals that share its tropical world. Would it take deer? Yes. But what about something more substantial? What about tapirs? What about cattle? What about, in the most nervous version of the question, people? The answer is that it probably could take some very large prey under the right conditions, but it would not make a habit of choosing the largest available animal every time. Constrictors are bound by gape, by handling, by digestion, and by the risk of injury during capture. Titanoboa would certainly be capable of subduing prey larger than any modern anaconda handles comfortably. A juvenile tapir or a medium-sized wild pig would be plausible. Large capybaras would be entirely plausible. Deer of various kinds, especially at crossings, would be routine where present. Calves of domestic livestock near wetland margins would likely be taken often enough to create intense conflict with nearby communities. That last point is nearly unavoidable. If people place livestock beside the habitat of a giant ambush constrictor, some of that livestock will eventually become part of the local food web, and no conservation brochure in the world can make that feel abstract to the owner of a missing calf. Domestic animals would present Titanoboa with a distinctly modern opportunity. Dogs wandering near marsh edges, goats tethered too close to reeds, pigs rooting along canal margins, cattle watering at floodplain ponds. None of these would be the ideal or natural prey in some romantic, untouched wilderness sense. But predators are not sentimental about the purity of ecosystems after humans arrive with edible mistakes. The larger and more successful the predator, the more likely it is to notice the practical advantages of domestic animals that lack proper defences or behave in predictable ways. So while Titanoboa would not be a farm hunter by preference, it would absolutely exploit human livestock where wetlands and rural settlement overlap. That fact alone would guarantee its reputation in local communities. There would probably also be age-related shifts in diet. Young Titanoboas, assuming they start life at manageable, though still thoroughly disrespectful sizes, would not immediately begin by dragging away deer or competing with adult caimans. Juveniles would likely feed on fish, amphibians, smaller reptiles, birds, eggs, and modest mammals. As they grew, their prey range would widen. Subadults might take larger birds, rodents, young caimans, and medium-sized mammals. Full adults would then move into the truly imposing prey bracket. This matters because a surviving species is not just a collection of giant adults. It is a pipeline of vulnerable younger animals making their way into giant adulthood. And in that pipeline, Titanoboa would be ecologically visible at many levels, not simply as one huge nightmare in a swamp, but as a species integrated across food webs from youth to maturity. Season would matter as well. In flood seasons, prey disperses, habitat expands, and encounters may become less predictable. In dry seasons, water contracts, animal movement becomes more focused, and predators gain a kind of map written by thirst. Titanoboa would almost certainly be a dry season specialist in some respects, not because it cannot function in floods, but because shrinking access points make ambush more efficient. When rivers fall and marsh pools isolate, life becomes concentrated. Fish bunch together. Mammals use narrower crossings. Birds crowd certain feeding grounds. A giant constrictor able to position itself in these pressure points would not need to chase much of anything. It would simply let scarcity do the organising. That sort of feeding ecology would also influence how often it needed to hunt. Very large constrictors can go long periods after major meals, especially in warm environments where digestion remains efficient, but movement need not be frequent. Titanoboa, with a successful large kill, might remain inactive for days or even longer while digesting. That means sightings would often come in pulses rather than as a constant stream. One missing animal here, another there. A period of silence, then a sudden confirmed sighting at a crossing point or by a carcass site. This pattern would make the animal feel even more mysterious than it actually was. People tend to interpret intermittent predators as supernatural when in fact they are simply energy efficient. There is also the question of competition. In habitats where jaguars, large caimans, anacondas, and Titanoboa overlap, who gets what? The answer would likely depend on size class, habitat structure, and timing. Jaguars would remain formidable terrestrial and semi-aquatic predators, especially on medium-sized mammals. Caimans would dominate certain aquatic ambush roles. Anacondas might overlap more strongly in niche, though the largest Titanoboas would almost certainly outclass them in prey capacity. That does not mean Titanoboa would replace every other predator. Ecosystems are not so tidy. Instead, one would expect a messy arrangement of partial overlap, mutual avoidance, opportunistic theft, occasional predation on one another's young, and a great many local adjustments. Wetland prey species would not merely fear one type of hunter. They would be living among an entire committee of bad outcomes. That committee, however, would not distribute pressure evenly. Titanoboa would likely favour prey that use edges, crossings, and shallow water. A giant constrictor is at its best when part of its body can remain supported and concealed, when prey comes close enough to strike without a long chase, and when the terrain reduces escape options. So while it could in theory hunt in more open ground, its best work would happen where hooves sink, footing slips, visibility narrows, and the prey animal does not fully understand how much of the bank is actually alive. In practical terms, this makes riverine mammals, marsh foragers, and water-dependent herbivores especially vulnerable. What about primates? In heavily forested regions, would Titanoboa take monkeys or other arboreal animals? Smaller and mid-sized individuals probably would if opportunities arose, particularly near water or at lower levels of the canopy. Large adults might be less inclined to pursue prey far above ground, simply because their immense mass would make arboreal hunting unrealistic outside specific circumstances. Titanoboa would not be a branch specialist. It would be a bank, root, shallows, and channel specialist. Monkeys descending to drink, crossing low branches near water, or sleeping in vulnerable positions near river margins could certainly be taken, but they would likely not form the backbone of the adult diet. As for humans, this is where careful realism matters. A snake of Titanoboa's size would almost certainly be physically capable of killing a human being. That much is difficult to avoid. The body power alone makes the question almost embarrassingly obvious. But capability is not the same as preference, and preference is what determines routine risk. Most large predators do not automatically treat humans as ideal prey. Humans are unusual animals. We move strangely, often in groups, make tools, create noise, and respond with disproportionate levels of administrative anger when eaten. Titanoboa would probably not seek humans as a primary food source. However, in areas of close overlap, especially near water, occasional attacks would be all but inevitable. A child near a swamp edge, a solitary adult washing or fishing in low visibility, someone stepping into reeds at dawn. Such incidents would likely be rare compared with the full range of the animal's feeding behaviour, but rarity offers little comfort when the event is both real and memorable enough to define public opinion for decades. and public opinion would be shaped far more by unusual attacks than by ordinary prey habits. A Titanoboa that ate capybaras, caimans, pigs, and the occasional calf would be ecologically fascinating. A Titanoboa that killed one person near a ferry crossing would become internationally infamous by sunset. That is the modern world. Predators may live by routine, but humans remember the exceptions. This mismatch would complicate conservation enormously. Scientists might argue, correctly, that the species mostly hunts wild prey and maintains its role in wetland ecosystems. Local communities, also correctly, might point out that mostly is not a particularly satisfying word when a snake the size of a collapsed telephone pole has demonstrated an interest in their shoreline. There is another modern prey source worth considering, and it says something mildly embarrassing about our species. In many parts of the world, human activity creates artificial concentrations of edible animals. Fish farms, duck enclosures, livestock pens near waterways, refuse attracting pigs or dogs, even transport routes where roadkill draws scavengers that in turn draw predators. Titanoboa would notice these patterns, not because it is cunning in some storybook sense, but because animals that survive long enough learn where food appears cheaply. If a fish farm sits beside warm marshland and lacks serious protective infrastructure, a giant snake will eventually regard it as a buffet arranged by committee. If cattle repeatedly cross the same wet stretch to reach pasture, the crossing will not remain a secret forever. Titanoboa would hunt the wild world, certainly, but it would also learn the bad habits of the managed one. This would have ecological effects beyond the immediate kills. Prey species living alongside Titanoboa would become more cautious at water. Herds might alter their routes. Nesting birds might avoid certain banks. Caiman juveniles might use different nursery areas. Capybara groups might bunch differently. Livestock owners would build fences or clear vegetation. Fishermen would stop using some channels after dark. In other words, Titanoboa would not simply remove biomass from the system, it would shape behaviour. Predators always do. The presence of a large ambush hunter changes not only who gets eaten, but how everyone else moves while trying very hard not to be. And that is perhaps the key point. If Titanoboa were still alive today, it would not need a menu of outlandish prey to justify its size. The modern tropics already contain plenty of animals large enough, vulnerable enough, and predictable enough to support such a predator, at least in the richest wetland systems. Capybaras, deer, pigs, tapirs, caimans, turtles, fish, birds, domestic stock, and occasionally humans would more than suffice. The terrifying part is not that Titanoboa would need to reinvent predation to survive. It would not. The modern world has already done the courtesy of remaining edible. That in turn leads to another thought. A giant predator can remain hidden for a long time if it hunts in places where disappearances are explainable one by one. A missing capybara is unfortunate. A missing pig is blamed on thieves, jaguars, or bad fencing. A vanished caiman does not submit a complaint. Even a lost calf becomes part of local frustration before it becomes scientific revelation. For a long while, a surviving Titanoboa might not announce itself through one enormous dramatic event, but through a pattern of absences that only slowly began to feel too heavy, too frequent, and too strangely arranged to ignore. And that is often how the modern world first realises it is sharing the landscape with something much older and larger than it had been prepared to admit. And that is exactly why the first realisation would not arrive as a clean, dramatic discovery with a helicopter shot and a triumphant orchestral swell. It would not begin with a scientist stepping into a clearing, adjusting their glasses and finding a perfectly arranged giant serpent waiting beside a tasteful fossil display for comparison. Real recognition would be messier than that, slower, much more human. The truth is that if Titanoboa were still alive today, people would probably not discover it all at once. They would argue their way toward it. The earliest awareness would almost certainly belong to the people living nearest the right habitats. not because they had special mystical access to ancient reptiles, but because they would be the ones fishing the dark channels, moving livestock near floodplains, checking traps at dawn, finding tracks in the mud, losing animals in ways that felt wrong, and hearing the sort of nighttime disturbance that does not sound like any ordinary struggle. That is how knowledge usually begins, not in journals, not in laboratories, in repetition, in practical unease, in the accumulation of small facts that fit together long before anyone with official credentials arrives to label them. A fisherman might see a wake too broad for a caiman and too deliberate for floating debris. A hunter might find a game trail pressed flat in a way that suggests not trampling, but weight dragged and redirected. A family might lose a pig near the reeds and find no blood, no scattered remains, no signs of jaguar claws, only a channel through the mud and water disturbed farther out than it should have been. A boatman might tell the same story 3 times over 10 years, each time with the same details, and be dismissed by people who have never tried to read a Blackwater river at dusk. That is usually how large, inconvenient truths begin. The people closest to them sound unreliable to people far away. In this version of the world, local names for the animal would almost certainly exist long before scientific agreement. Not one name, but many. Different river systems, different communities, different languages, each one carrying its own term for the same broad idea. The heavy snake, the old water snake, the one that stays where the bank collapses, the one the dogs refuse to follow, the river coil, the marsh giant. Some names would be matter of fact, some would be wrapped in warning. Some would sound almost casual until an outsider asked why children were never allowed near a certain backwater after dark. People do not need museum labels to build a vocabulary around danger. They only need enough generations of hard experience. That is one of the reasons the wider human world would take so long to realize what was happening. For the local communities, it would not initially be framed as the survival of a prehistoric species. It would be framed as a serious animal that belonged to serious places. The scientific romance of it, the thrill of a lost giant enduring through deep time, would come later, and mostly from people whose boots were cleaner. Nearby residents would understand the creature first as a fact of geography and caution. Outsiders, especially urban outsiders, would tend to interpret the same reports through the usual filters: folklore, exaggeration, fear, unreliable memory, bad visibility, too much distance, too much heat, too much story. A large anaconda seen badly becomes a legend. A sequence of strange losses becomes superstition. A warning told by elders becomes colourful local tradition. That is the ordinary failure mode of modern confidence. We trust remote systems more than local repetition until remote systems finally stumble over the same truth and claim to have found it. There would probably be records too. Not perfect ones, but enough to trouble anyone who went back through them later with new eyes. Colonial travel journals mentioning unusually large serpents in floodplain country. Missionary notes about river crossings avoided by local guides without clear explanation. Rubber boom era camp reports of livestock vanishing near certain channels. Hunting records that distinguish between ordinary giant snakes and something larger, rarer, and much more carefully avoided. Early naturalists might preserve skins of impressive but incomplete specimens, mismeasure them, lose them, or dismiss them as stretched stories attached to stretched hides. That would be one of the more frustrating aspects for future historians. Once the truth emerged, everyone would discover that pieces of it had been sitting around in notebooks, archives, and side comments for decades, perhaps centuries, waiting for someone to stop assuming the world was already fully indexed. Even in the 20th century, with better equipment and more systematic fieldwork, the pattern could continue. Aerial surveys would miss a great deal under canopy and along dark banks. Zoologists might hear the same accounts again and again, always attached to habitats difficult to access and witnesses who had little interest in being treated as entertainment. Some would dismiss the stories, some would quietly take them seriously. A few camera trap images might emerge over the years, but without scale they would look ambiguous. A broad body in water, a shed skin too large to dismiss comfortably, a thermal anomaly along a river margin that could be many things if one were determined to preserve one's peace of mind. Science is cautious for good reason, but caution can look a lot like stubbornness when the subject is large enough to embarrass entire assumptions about extinction. The real turning point, the moment wider humanity first realised it was still alive, would probably come when several lines of evidence collided at once and refused to be explained away separately. That is how modern belief usually works. One witness can be doubted. One photo can be called a hoax. One carcass can be blamed on misidentification. But when video, tissue, tracks, independent sightings, and perhaps a dead or captured juvenile all appear within a narrow window, skepticism loses its footing rather quickly. It might begin during a severe flood season or a severe dry season, because environmental stress has a way of forcing hidden animals into visibility. Floods displace everything. Dry spells compress everything. Either one could expose Titanoboa more than usual. Imagine a season of unusual drought in a major tropical wetland. Water pulls back from side channels. Fish and reptiles crowd into shrinking pools. Mammals approach the remaining access points more often. Human boats and livestock do the same. Suddenly a species adapted to use diffuse hidden wet habitat is forced into narrower space. Sightings rise. So do conflicts. A ranch loses several calves in 1 month near the same drainage basin. 2 fishing crews independently film a massive body crossing a channel at dawn. One crew abandons its catch and runs, which adds a highly persuasive level of shaking to the footage. A wildlife officer investigates the bank and finds drag marks that do not belong to any known animal in the current reference guide. Still, even then, public recognition might lag behind official discomfort. Authorities would try to verify before alarming anyone. Biologists would argue over scale. Herpetologists would inspect track patterns, body impressions, shed skin fragments, and bite geometry on carcasses. Samples would be collected. DNA would be tested. Perhaps the first lab result would be confusing rather than helpful, showing relation to known boas but not matching any living species cleanly enough to settle the matter. That would be a very modern sort of revelation. The computers would not politely print Titanoboa confirmed. They would produce data that became more alarming the longer competent people stared at it. The first truly undeniable proof might come from a mortality event, because nature and certainty have a regrettable habit of meeting through death. A very large individual could be killed accidentally in a landslide, struck by machinery during flood control work, wounded in a conflict near livestock, or found dead after swallowing prey in a place where retreat failed. One imagines a road crew, a dredging team, or a reservoir maintenance unit stumbling into the sort of discovery that ruins everyone's week and improves several scientific careers beyond measure. At first they would think it was an anaconda beyond all reason. Then measurements would continue. Then the body would continue. Then the room temperature of the conversation would change. But even a dead adult would not immediately convince everyone. The sheer size would provoke disbelief. Officials would worry about panic. Governments might restrict images until verification was complete. Researchers would insist on careful analysis. News would leak anyway, because that is what news does when large dead things appear near places with mobile phones. Grainy images would spread first, followed by breathless captions, followed by confident nonsense, followed by fierce denial, followed by higher quality photographs that made denial difficult, followed by commentators who had spent the previous 48 hours declaring the whole thing fake and were now explaining that they had always believed local communities deserved more respect. A captured juvenile or subadult might actually be even more effective in persuading the world, strange as that sounds. A manageable living specimen with clear video, measured length, identifiable anatomy, and proper tissue samples would be harder to dismiss than a decomposing giant whose proportions seem too outrageous for comfort. Imagine a young Titanoboa, still terrifying by any reasonable standard, trapped after repeated livestock losses near a floodplain settlement. It is not 40 feet long, but it is large enough to demonstrate the lineage beyond question. Its skull structure, scales, vertebral features, and genetics all point towards something astonishing. Now the world has a living representative. Then the larger reports behind it begin to look much less like folklore and much more like adult-size classes. Once that threshold had been crossed, the public story would move very quickly, far faster than the years of local knowledge that came before it. News outlets would frame it as a prehistoric giant discovered alive. Documentaries would be commissioned before field teams had even finished their first proper surveys. Every earlier report from the region would be revisited. Local witnesses who had been ignored for decades would suddenly be interviewed as if they had materialized from nowhere rather than being the same people officials had politely failed to listen to all along. Social media would do what it always does with extraordinary animal news. Some would be fascinated, some would make jokes, some would insist that every muddy stick in every tropical river was now Titanoboa. Some would demand extermination, some would demand immediate global protections. Most would underestimate how complicated the situation had become for the people living where the animal actually existed. Because from the perspective of those communities, the first realization by the wider world would feel very late. They would not experience it as revelation, they would experience it as confirmation mixed with irritation. Yes, that snake. Yes, the one we said was there. Yes, the channels we told you to avoid. Yes, the missing animals you turned into lectures about evidence and measurement. There would be resentment in that. Not theatrical resentment, just the ordinary kind that forms when people with better access to microphones take a long time to catch up with people who had better access to the ground. Scientists worthy of the name would recognize this quickly. The best field researchers would understand that the first real database on Titanoboa would not begin in satellite imaging or laboratory sequencing. It would begin in local memory, in maps drawn from experience, in seasonal patterns known by boatmen, in the old rule that one bend is safe in high water and not in low, in the old rule that dogs become restless before the reeds move, in the old rule that a stretch of bank with too few birds and too many slides in the mud should not be approached alone. Traditional ecological knowledge would suddenly become priceless, not because it was mystical, but because it was patient. Still, the official naming and recognition process would matter. Once the evidence settled, once comparative anatomy and genetics did their work, the scientific community would face the peculiar task of confirming the survival of an animal thought long gone. That would create one of the most extraordinary moments in modern zoology. Extinction, which usually feels final in the public imagination, would be forced open again. A creature known from Paleocene fossils would not just have a descendant alive today, but the lineage itself recognisably close enough to justify the old name in public understanding. Museums would rework exhibits. Schoolbooks would require correction. The timeline of deep history would suddenly have a live wire running into the present. Of course, recognition would also force law into motion. Protected status, emergency habitat assessments, conflict response teams, restrictions on killing specimens, restrictions on approaching them, restrictions on publicising sensitive breeding sites. Governments would have to decide very quickly whether Titanoboa was primarily a conservation miracle or a public safety problem. The answer would be both, which is never the answer administrators enjoy receiving. Insurance providers, local officials, environmental ministries and rural communities would all begin using the same animal for different arguments. That is one of the surest signs a species has become real in the modern world. Not when it appears on television, but when paperwork begins reproducing around it. And yet the emotional realization for most people would happen through image rather than policy. One piece of footage, properly scaled, impossible to ignore, would likely become the global reference point. Perhaps a drone shot of a giant individual crossing a pale sandbar between dark pools with a survey boat nearby for scale. Perhaps nighttime thermal footage showing a body of impossible length half submerged beside cattle on a floodplain margin. Perhaps a rescue team relocating a stranded specimen after a storm, the machine and the animal sharing the frame in a way that leaves no room for interpretive optimism. That would be the image people remembered. Not the first true evidence perhaps, but the first evidence to settle in the collective mind. From that point on, Titanoboa would no longer be an argument. It would be part of reality, and reality would feel a little less settled around warm water than it had the week before. There would also be a wave of false realization attached to the true one. Every supposed earlier sighting would be reinterpreted. Every giant snake story would be reconsidered. Some would indeed fit the pattern, many would not. This is what happens whenever a hidden truth is confirmed. It attracts both clarity and clutter. Serious field teams would have to separate the two while the public did its best to become unhelpfully enthusiastic. Rivers nowhere near suitable habitat would suddenly receive reports. Tourists would misidentify ordinary anacondas at hysterical distances. Hoaxes would appear. People would post edited videos. Somewhere, inevitably, a garden hose would trend. Reality always collects nonsense as a sort of tax. But the more disciplined part of the response would keep building. Researchers would map sightings against habitat features. They would compare ancient climate requirements with present-day thermal regimes. They would examine whether the surviving lineage had changed in size or behaviour relative to fossil estimates. They would study diet through isotopes, git contents from deceased individuals, environmental DNA in waterways, prey remains near basking or breeding areas. They would begin the slow work of turning revelation into understanding. And in doing so, they would discover something rather uncomfortable. Titanoboa had not survived by being everywhere. It had survived by being exactly where modern systems were least complete, least confident, and least willing to spend time in chest-deep water with uncertain footing. This would also reframe many earlier human absences, missing livestock in certain flood zones, unusual caiman injuries, disturbances blamed on smugglers or jaguars, odd local regulations around particular wetlands. The past would begin to look different in light of the present. That is often the strangest part of realizing something was still alive. It does not only change your picture of now, it changes your interpretation of everything that happened around it while you were busy believing it was gone. And once the realization spread beyond the first shock, beyond the first museum updates and emergency meetings and documentaries, the world would have to face a more practical question. A giant ancient constrictor had survived into an age of roads, levees, farms, fences, cargo routes, expanding towns and drained wetlands. In other words, the animal had not returned to a human world. It had persisted into one that had been rearranging its habitat for generations. So the next thing everyone would need to understand, and quickly, is how those human structures would shape where Titanoboa could still go, what it would avoid, what it would cross, and where the old wetland hunter would begin colliding with the very modern lines people had drawn across the land. At first glance, it might seem obvious that a creature like Titanoboa would simply disappear wherever human development became dense enough. Cities rise, roads spread, wetlands are drained, cattle move in, riverbanks are straightened, and before long the ancient giant is pushed neatly back into some shrinking corner of the map. That is the usual story we tell ourselves about large predators in the modern world. Civilization expands, wilderness retreats, the old animal loses. There is truth in that story, certainly, but it is not the whole truth, and with a giant wetland constrictor the pattern would be more complicated than a simple retreat into remoteness. Titanoboa would not respond to cities, farms, and roads in a single uniform way. Some human changes would destroy parts of its range outright. Some would fragment it. Some would create strange new opportunities. Some would increase conflict so sharply that local populations might vanish even where habitat still looks suitable on paper. And some would do that especially frustrating thing modern landscapes often do, which is to remain superficially green and watery while becoming, from the animal's point of view, completely wrong. That distinction matters. Habitat is not just a patch of colour on a map. a wetland can still be a wetland and yet no longer function like one. The water may be too disturbed, the banks may be too open, the prey may be replaced by livestock and noise, the night may be split by engines, artificial light, dogs, and people moving on schedules no giant ambush predator can ignore. So if Titanoboa were still alive today, human development would not merely reduce its range in terms of size, it would change the shape, texture and behaviour of that range from the inside. Cities would be the most obvious barrier, though perhaps not for the reasons people first imagine. A giant snake would not avoid a city because it recognised skyscrapers as somehow philosophically offensive. It would avoid cities because dense urban spaces strip away the exact conditions that make a giant constrictor successful. They remove concealment. They replace soft, irregular shorelines with walls, docks, drainage systems and traffic. They flood the environment with vibration, constant movement, artificial light and human presence. They break the quiet patterns Titanoboa would depend on. An ambush predator does not need silence in the poetic sense, but it does need enough regularity to predict movement and enough cover to remain invisible while doing so. A dense city offers neither in the right way. Still, cities built beside major tropical rivers would not simply erase Titanoboa from the picture entirely. They would create hard edges in its range. The main urban waterfront might be too exposed and too disturbed for the species to use regularly. But nearby backwaters, drainage marshes, industrial fringes, abandoned canals, and peri-urban wetlands could become uneasy buffer zones. In those places, the animal would not be an urban resident in the way rats or pigeons are urban residents. It would be a holdover at the margins, pressing up against the city without joining it, creating the sort of geography people dislike because it prevents them from believing the city as fully one. This would be especially true in tropical regions where development often advances unevenly. A modern city can have busy roads, dense neighbourhoods, fuel depots, river terminals, and then, rather suddenly, a belt of reeds, flood channels, half-drained marsh, and neglected land that no one has fully claimed because the ground is too wet, too unstable, or too politically inconvenient to sort out properly. Titanoboa would care very little for zoning plans. It would care very much about whether that fringe still held warm water, cover and prey. So while city centres would cut the species off, city edges could become dangerous little seams in the map, places where ancient predator and modern expansion stand uncomfortably close without fully mixing. Farms would affect the range differently. Unlike cities, farms often preserve open space, water access, and animal biomass. That sounds promising at first, but for Titanoboa it would be a mixed blessing. On one hand, agriculture would destroy or simplify large amounts of suitable habitat. Forest would be cleared, floodplain vegetation would be cut back, wetlands would be drained or straightened, river margins would be trampled by cattle, fire would be used more often, human presence would become predictable and constant. These changes would reduce the places where a giant snake could remain hidden, rest safely, breed successfully, and move without constant exposure. On the other hand, farms create prey. Not always wild prey, not always the right kind, but prey nonetheless. Calves, pigs, goats, dogs, poultry, rodents around feed storage, and the chain of scavengers and smaller predators that gather around human-managed landscapes. So farms would not just push Titanoboa away, they would tempt it toward conflict. This is a familiar pattern in predator ecology. Human land use removes the old system and then replaces it with a simpler, riskier system, full of easier food and angrier responses. A wetland giant that might once have taken capybaras and caimans in marsh margins would now find cattle ponds, drainage ditches, and livestock trails leading right to the water's edge. That would pull the species into a fractured range rather than a cleanly shrinking one. Some farming regions would become dead zones where habitat had been simplified too completely. Others would become conflict corridors where Titanoboa still moved through, hunted opportunistically and suffered retaliation. A few might even become temporary strongholds if human pressure remained light enough and enough marsh or riparian vegetation survived between pasture blocks. In other words, the range would become patchy, irregular, and politically charged. Not simply natural habitat here and human land there, but a constantly shifting pattern of tolerable areas, dangerous crossings, refuge wetlands, and conflict hotspots. Roads would make this much worse, because roads do not only remove habitat, they divide it. For a species like Titanoboa, roads would be especially disruptive. A giant snake tied to water and cover does not move across the landscape the way a deer or a cat might. It would likely follow river corridors, marsh belts, drainage lines, swamp forests, and seasonally flooded lowlands. Roads slicing across those pathways would force crossings at predictable points. Culverts, bridges, drainage cuts, and low causeways would become bottlenecks. That would matter for two reasons. First, bottlenecks create mortality. Large animals crossing roads are struck, photographed, reported, and often killed deliberately if people panic. Second, bottlenecks create visibility. A snake that survives by remaining difficult to detect suddenly becomes measurable every time it has to negotiate infrastructure. There is something almost tragic in that. The same routes that would let Titanoboa persist through altered landscapes would also expose it to the modern world's most efficient system for converting movement into death or headlines. A giant snake crossing a remote marsh road at night would not simply be making its way through habitat. It would be entering the sphere of headlights, phone cameras, trucks, and the very human tendency to hit first and sort out the ecological implications later. Road mortality alone could reshape the range over decades, not necessarily by wiping out the species everywhere, but by cutting off smaller populations from each other. A healthy species needs exchange. Individuals disperse, genes move. Young animals leave crowded or risky areas and establish themselves elsewhere. If roads, fences, settlements, and open farmland sever those movements often enough, then the map starts to crack. You no longer have one broad living system. You have isolated pockets. Some remain viable, some become inbred, some lose breeding adults faster than they replace them. Some vanish after a flood, a drought, or a local killing campaign, and no neighbouring population can recolonise them because the corridor between them has been chopped into fields, villages, and paved lines. That is how human infrastructure would most profoundly change Titanoboa's range. Not merely by shrinking it at the edges, but by breaking its continuity. An ancient giant wetland serpent might still survive in the modern world, but it would do so in fragments, and fragments are vulnerable. Bridges and culverts would become especially important in this broken landscape. Some would act as accidental wildlife corridors. Others would become death traps. A bridge over a broad river with vegetated banks might allow movement underneath, preserving connectivity even where traffic runs above. A narrow culvert through dry season pasture might funnel young snakes into places where dogs, people, and machinery wait. Engineers would eventually learn this, of course. Once Titanoboa became officially recognised, wildlife planners would have to think seriously about snake movement in the same way modern conservation already considers crossings for large mammals. That would produce one of the stranger bureaucratic developments of the age. Serious meetings about designing infrastructure that either keeps giant prehistoric constrictors away from schools and farms, or allows them to pass safely beneath highways without alarming commuters. Dams would create another layer of complication. People often think of dams as simple barriers, but ecologically they reorganise whole systems. Water levels change, flood pulses shift, marshes disappear in one place and emerge in another, fish movement changes, riverbank vegetation changes, human settlement patterns change around reservoirs and access roads. For Titanoboa, a dam could destroy one favoured hunting zone while creating another farther upstream or downstream. Reservoir margins might in some cases produce sheltered warm coves, reed beds, and prey concentrations that a giant snake could use. But reservoirs are also heavily monitored, used by boats, and lined in many places by steep banks or fluctuating water levels that do not behave like natural wetlands. So the net effect would probably be negative for stable range, even if some individual snakes exploited reservoir edges opportunistically. Drainage projects would likely be even worse. A marsh drained for agriculture or flood control does not always look dead to a casual observer. There may still be water in ditches, vegetation in patches, birds in numbers, but from the point of view of a giant ambush constrictor, the system may be broken beyond usefulness. Water that once lingered broadly now rushes away in channels. Prey movement becomes less predictable. Breeding sites vanish. Cover thins. Human access increases. Dogs get in. Guns get in. Fire gets in. A drained wetland does not need to be paved over to stop functioning as Titanoboa country. It only needs to stop behaving like wetland. That would produce a recurring illusion in public conversation. Officials might insist that plenty of suitable habitat remained, because satellite imagery still showed green floodplain mosaics. Local people and field biologists would know better. They would know which marshes still held deep, quiet water, and which had become noisy, shallow leftovers crossed by cattle and dirt bikes. Titanoboa would force planners to confront something they often prefer to avoid, which is that habitat quality and habitat appearance are not the same thing. Farms and roads would also change the range by changing prey. Capybaras may thrive in some agricultural mosaics. Caimans may persist in irrigation channels and ponds. Rodents often increase around grain and disturbed land. Livestock provides tempting but dangerous opportunities. Other native prey may decline sharply. So Titanoboa would not simply lose food as development spread. It would see the menu rearranged. In some areas, that rearrangement might support short-term survival while increasing long-term conflict. A snake population feeding partly on livestock or farm-associated prey may persist for a time, but it also paints a target on itself. Farmers do not generally admire ecological nuance when calves begin vanishing near the drainage canal. This would likely create a pattern seen in many predator species. Core populations surviving in protected or difficult habitats, surrounded by a halo of unstable edge populations living near human-modified land. The core areas would be the real engines of long-term persistence. The edge populations would be more visible, more likely to cause headlines and more likely to be killed. Outsiders might think Titanoboa was spreading because those edge encounters received so much attention. In reality, the species might be quietly losing its deepest and safest range, while only becoming more noticeable around the margins. Protected areas would help, but not perfectly. A national park or biological reserve containing major wetlands could serve as a sanctuary, especially if it included connected river corridors and enough warm, prey-rich habitat. But reserves on paper are not always quiet in practice. Roads may still border them. Settlements may still push against them. Illegal fishing, hunting, logging, and extraction may continue inside. Fire may creep in. Climate shifts may alter water regimes. Titanoboa would benefit from protection, certainly, but it would also expose the limits of modern protected areas for a species that needs space, water connectivity, and tolerance beyond the reserve fence. Because fences, incidentally, would do more than people expect. Rural fencing around farms and ranches would not stop a very large snake absolutely, but it would channel movement. Repeated encounters with wire, barriers, cleared lines and enclosed paddocks would push Titanoboa into certain routes and away from others. Over time, that would create habitual travel corridors. Some would follow creeks and levees. Some would skirt the backs of cattle properties. Some would run along flood-controlled channels or drainage belts. This would make the range more structured but also more predictable, at least to those who paid attention. Locals would learn which fence lines mysteriously sagged after wet nights, which culverts should not be approached alone in late summer, which stretches of canal bank lost dogs often enough to deserve a nickname. There is another subtle effect worth noticing. Cities, farms, and roads would not merely shrink the snake's range across land. they would also alter the emotional geography of that range. Certain areas would become known snake places, not because Titanoboa lived only there, but because infrastructure made encounters more likely there. Bridge crossings, irrigation canals, ranch ponds, road-adjacent marsh. The species might still be more abundant deeper in protected wetlands, but public fear would cluster around the interfaces, the places where human structures and snake movement rub together often enough to make memory. That would distort policy. Resources might be poured into highly visible conflict zones, while the quieter and more important core habitats received less attention because they produced fewer dramatic phone videos. And then there is expansion. Not just human expansion, but the possibility of Titanoboa adjusting its own range in response to altered landscapes. It would not adapt to cities in the cosy urban wildlife sense. No one would be leaving out bins for it, one hopes. But in a warming world, some formerly marginal wetlands might become thermally more suitable. Artificial canals might create movement routes between systems once less connected. Retention ponds, reservoir edges, irrigation belts, and newly flooded lowlands could offer stepping stones, however dangerous. So while human infrastructure would mostly contract and fragment the ancient range, it might also generate a few strange new frontiers. Not enough to outweigh the losses, but enough to make the modern distribution less predictable than a simple shrinking blob on a map. This unpredictability would make management incredibly difficult. Imagine trying to explain to a frightened community that the giant snake is declining overall, while also admitting that recent sightings in their district have increased. Both could be true. A species under pressure often becomes more visible at the edge because safe habitat is disappearing elsewhere. People do not like that sort of answer. It sounds suspiciously like bad comfort. Yet ecologically it makes perfect sense. Titanoboa's range would not fade politely from the centre outward. It would warp, narrow, fray, and occasionally lurch into new contact zones just when everyone was hoping the problem had gone away. Over generations, this would reshape human maps as much as snake maps. Some floodplain developments would be abandoned or never attempted because the conflict proved too costly. Some road designs would be altered. Some farm belts would intensify their bank clearing and fencing to push the species farther from stock. Some wetland reserves would gain extraordinary political importance because they held the last connected breeding populations. Insurance categories would shift. Land values in certain marsh-adjacent zones might even reflect Titanoboa risk, the way some modern properties reflect flood risk, wildfire risk, or crocodile presence. That may sound slightly absurd, but it is exactly the sort of practical translation modern societies eventually produce. Ancient predator becomes actuarial line item. It is not glamorous, but it is one of the surest signs the species has become part of the functioning present. And through all of this, the range would tell a very human story. Not just of an animal surviving development, but of the development failing to fully erase an older logic of the land. Roads would cut, farms would simplify, cities would harden edges, yet the warm, wet, difficult places would remain stubborn. Some channels would still flood, some marshes would still resist drainage, some forests would still stand in water half the year, some stretches of bank would still go quiet in exactly the same way they did centuries earlier. Titanoboa would persist in those residues of the old world, though not untouched by the new one. Which also means the species would not just be a biological presence, it would become a cultural one in a much sharper way than before. Once cities, farms, and roads had pushed it into visible conflict zones and fragmented strongholds, people would no longer think of it only as a hidden giant in distant wetlands. They would think of it as a creature tangled up with human expansion itself, feared, cursed, respected, politicized, protected by some, hated by others, filmed from bridges, whispered about in farm country, turned into warning signs and tabloid headlines and bedtime threats and conservation symbols all at once. And that is usually the point where an animal stops being just an animal in the public imagination and starts becoming something much larger, stranger, and more difficult to manage. A myth that still has a heartbeat. And once an animal reaches that point, once it stops being only a biological fact and starts living inside headlines, warnings, gossip and memory, it no longer belongs only to the wetland. It begins to live in the mind as well. That is where Titanoboa would become something larger than its own body. Not physically larger, which would really be asking too much of everyone, but socially larger, emotionally larger, culturally heavier. A giant snake living in the modern world would not merely hunt, breed, bask and move through marsh channels. It would collect stories, it would collect fear, it would collect fascination at a rate that very few other animals could match. That is partly because snakes already arrive with unusual baggage. Humans do not feel about snakes the way they feel about deer, parrots, or even large cats. Snakes occupy a different emotional shelf. Some people admire them deeply, some fear them on sight. Many who claim to be neutral are, in practice, only neutral from a healthy distance and in good lighting. A snake does not need to be large to produce strong reactions. Make it enormous, ancient, rare, and associated with dark water, and you no longer have an ordinary wildlife story. You have a pressure point in the human imagination. Fear would come first, naturally, and it would not need exaggeration to do its work. A giant constrictor hidden in tropical wetlands would trigger several old human alarms at once. There is the fear of ambush, which is always stronger than the fear of open confrontation. A charging animal is frightening, but it is visible. An animal that can remain unseen until the last moment activates a much older and less rational part of the brain. There is the fear of water that conceals more than it reveals. There is the fear of size, especially size arranged low to the ground where it feels close and difficult to judge. And there is the fear of silence, because snakes do not roar, bark, or generally offer the courtesy of advance notice. Titanoboa would combine all of these into one animal, and that would make it unusually efficient at occupying mental space far beyond its actual range. People living near it would develop a practical fear rather than a theatrical one. That difference matters. Practical fear is rarely loud. It is built into routines. It shows up in where children are allowed to play, what time animals are watered, which bank is used in the morning and which one is not used at all after rain. It shows up in the calm way an elder tells a younger person not to stand near that crossing alone. It shows up in the number of people who carry lights, poles, dogs, or simply a companion when moving through certain areas. Practical fear does not need a dramatic voice, it simply changes behaviour. In regions where Titanoboa lived, that sort of fear would become ordinary, not comfortable, not forgotten, but folded into life in the way flood knowledge or storm knowledge gets folded into life. Outside those regions, fear would become much more imaginative. News reports would amplify unusual attacks, close calls, livestock losses, and photographs of impossible tracks beside roads. People far from the actual habitat would react to the idea of Titanoboa rather than the daily reality of it. This is where the emotional scale of the animal would grow wildly. In distant cities and countries, Titanoboa would become the wetland made flesh, a symbol of untouched danger, something modern enough to appear on a screen but ancient enough to feel like it should not exist alongside air travel and shopping centres. That gap between the ordinary world and the animal's prehistoric aura would create a special kind of fascination. It would not just be dangerous, it would feel misplaced, and humans are deeply interested in things that seem to have arrived in the wrong era. That fascination would not cancel the fear. The two would feed each other. Large predators already do this to some extent. Sharks, crocodiles, bears, and big cats all attract a mix of dread and admiration. But Titanoboa would occupy a different tier because it would resist easy emotional sorting. A tiger looks powerful in a way humans understand. A whale looks enormous in a way humans can marvel at from a distance. Titanoboa would look wrong in a more intimate sense. It would be too long, too thick, too quiet, too tied to places where footing is uncertain and visibility is poor. To admire it would require passing directly through unease first. That tends to produce very strong public attention. Documentaries would treat it with a kind of reverence edged in alarm. Nature filmmakers would compete to get the first full behavioural footage of a wild adult at close range, preferably without making a final career choice in the process. Long lens footage of a giant body moving through floodwater would circulate endlessly. Slow-motion sequences of a coil tightening around a caiman or a capybara would become unavoidable in every serious wildlife series about tropical rivers. Museums would redesign their giant reptile exhibits around it. Children would memorize its name. Adults would pretend they were handling the idea calmly, while quietly deciding never to vacation anywhere containing mangroves, reeds, or warm, still water ever again. At the same time, popular culture would do what it always does with animals that already feel half mythical. It would exaggerate, commercialize, distort, and multiply them. Titanoboa would appear in films, many of them dreadful. Some would present it as a cunning river demon capable of swallowing boats whole, which would be nonsense, though one can never entirely rule out the modern appetite for nonsense if a large enough budget is attached. Adventure novels would place it in forgotten lagoons. Survival shows would speak its name in a lower voice than necessary. Children's cartoons would somehow turn it into a mischievous giant noodle with a heart of gold, because there is no creature so alarming that merchandising cannot eventually soften it. Local myths, though, would be much more interesting than global pop culture. In places where Titanoboa had lived for generations, the stories would not be invented for spectacle. They would be practical first, meaningful second. Some would be cautionary tales told to keep children away from dangerous water. Others would tie the animal to flood cycles, river changes, and stretches of land regarded as old or difficult. There might be stories of a giant snake that shifts channels when the water is high, or sleeps under collapsed banks, or punishes people who fish greedily in nursery pools. To an outsider, these might sound symbolic. To a local listener, they would sound like what they often are: memory encoded as narrative. That is one of the oldest uses of myth. People do not always separate ecology from story the way modern institutions do. If a place is dangerous in a recurring way, the warning becomes easier to remember when attached to a creature with motives, habits, and presence. Do not cross there at dusk in the dry season may be good advice. That is where the old river snake waits when the fish are trapped low, is good advice people are more likely to repeat. Titanoboa would inspire exactly that kind of practical storytelling. The myth would not hide reality, it would carry it. Of course, once the wider world became aware of the species, people would begin trying to separate real Titanoboa from legendary Titanoboa, and they would not always succeed. Some stories would clearly describe actual encounters, just filtered through years of retelling. Others would be symbolic from the beginning. Some would combine ordinary giant snakes with the rarer and much larger Titanoboa, creating a layered folklore in which scale shifts depending on who is telling it, where, and why. A missing calf becomes a giant serpent. A giant serpent becomes a guardian of a flooded forest. A guardian becomes a warning not to cut certain trees. A warning becomes a village story children hear so often that they stop noticing it is also a map of risk. This is how animal myth usually works. It does not begin with fantasy and drift toward truth. It begins with truth and grows branches. Religion and spirituality would almost certainly gather around the animal as well, especially in communities with long relationships to river systems and ancestral landscapes. Not everyone would treat Titanoboa as sacred, of course. Some would simply regard it as dangerous wildlife, but in other places, a creature that ancient, that large, that difficult to see, and that tied so closely to floodplain life would attract symbolic meaning almost automatically. It might represent the force of the river itself, the oldness of the land, the danger of greed, the need for respect at certain crossings, or the boundary between settled life and untamed wet country. Sacred groves and dangerous channels have always been close neighbours in human culture. Titanoboa would fit into that arrangement rather well. There would also be taboos, areas where one does not fish at certain times, rituals before entering some marshes, rules against mocking sightings or naming the animal carelessly near water. Outsiders might dismiss this as superstition until they realise the taboo often mapped neatly onto breeding areas, seasonal crossings, or especially risky stretches of bank. Fear becomes ceremony more easily than modern people like to admit. Ceremony in turn preserves caution better than a laminated government sign that blows away in the first storm. In modern media environments, the myths would spread far beyond the habitats that made them. Some would travel well and remain roughly intact. Others would be flattened into clickbait within hours. The internet would be an absolute disaster around Titanoboa. Every low-resolution clip of ripples in tropical water would be labelled a possible sighting. Every unusually long anaconda would become a debate. Old stories from river communities would be copied, mistranslated, and stripped of the context that made them useful. People would share maps of confirmed Titanoboa zones, produced by individuals whose relationship with geography is mostly decorative. Conspiracy theories would appear almost immediately. Governments are hiding nest sites. Scientists underreport the size of adults. There are secret breeding programs. There are albino specimens in military compounds for reasons no one will explain. This is what happens whenever something both real and extraordinary enters global circulation. Facts survive, but they do not travel alone. That might sound silly, and some of it would be, but the silliness would have consequences. Conservation debates would become contaminated by hysteria. Local witness accounts would be mixed up with obvious nonsense. Real safety measures would be harder to communicate because officials would have to speak through a cloud of viral exaggeration and deliberate fabrication. At the same time, the species would gain a peculiar kind of protection simply because it had become so famous. Titanoboa would attract funding, documentaries, research teams, and protected area campaigns in a way few less charismatic reptiles ever could. Fear and fascination would become a conservation engine, however unreliable. Tourism would follow, because it always does. Somewhere, inevitably, someone would decide that the safest way to honour a giant secretive ambush predator was to sell guided viewing experiences. There would be Titanoboa country lodges, night marsh safaris, observation towers over suspected channels, and souvenir shops full of mugs that say things like, "I survived Snake River," despite the worrying implication that survival had not been guaranteed at check-in. Local economies in some areas would benefit. Others would be strained by reckless visitors who mistook a living predator for a kind of scaled attraction. Conservationists would argue with tour operators. Tour operators would argue with safety officers. Safety officers would argue with everyone. The snake, meanwhile, would continue being a snake and remain largely unimpressed by marketing language. Children would grow up with Titanoboa in very different ways depending on where they lived. In regions far from the habitat, it would become one of those thrilling facts adults deploy to keep bedtime conversations interesting and lightly alarming. School books would place it alongside dinosaurs, giant sharks, and other creatures that make the world feel larger than the classroom. Toys would appear. Posters would appear. There would be a brief and unhelpful period where children everywhere became very interested in hiding toy snakes in bathtubs and under sofa cushions, which would test domestic patience in new ways. In regions where the species actually lived, childhood would be shaped more concretely. Titanoboa would become part of practical education. Learn the water, learn the signs, learn where not to stand, learn why the dogs bark differently at the reeds than they do at strangers, learn why adults go silent at some stories. That sort of education does not create dramatic fear so much as deep respect. People raised with dangerous animals usually do not spend every day panicking. They spend every day knowing. Even art would change around the animal. Painters, carvers, mask makers, Textile artists, tattooists and filmmakers would all use the image of Titanoboa differently. Some would focus on power and scale, others on stealth, others on the patterned body as a marker of old river country. Some communities might stylize it into almost geometric forms, coiling around symbols of water and flood. Urban artists far away might turn it into a symbol of nature outlasting human certainty. Protest movements might use it in environmental campaigns. "The old river is still alive" would be exactly the sort of slogan someone would eventually print on banners. The snake would become not just an animal, but a shorthand for the persistence of the wild in places people had hoped were manageable. There would also be political myths around it, which are often the most persistent of all. Some would use Titanoboa as proof that remote regions should be locked down and heavily controlled. Others would use it to argue against development in fragile wetlands. Some would exaggerate danger to justify land grabs or forced resettlement. Others would minimize danger to protect tourism revenue or industrial expansion. The same animal would be described as an ancient treasure, a nuisance predator, a sacred being, a public hazard, a climate relic, and a symbol of national natural heritage, depending on who was speaking and what budget they needed approved. Very little about that would be unique to Titanoboa. Humans have always been excellent at turning powerful animals into arguments. What would be unique is the sheer cultural elasticity of the creature. Few animals could plausibly function as local warning, global sensation, sacred figure, scientific marvel, internet fixation, an economic problem all at once. Titanoboa could. It would be one of the rare species that managed to seem overexposed and still not fully known. Every new image would sharpen it and deepen the mystery at the same time. That is usually a sign that an animal has crossed into true mythic territory, not because it has stopped being real, but because reality keeps refusing to settle it down. And yet the strongest myths would probably remain the simplest ones. Not the secret laboratory theories, not the tourist slogans, not the cinematic nonsense about snakes swallowing helicopters, which would be insulting to both engineering and digestion. The strongest myths would be the old stories that stay close to the ground. Do not fish alone there. Do not sleep near that channel. Do not laugh when the water goes quiet. Do not assume the bank is empty because it looks empty. Those are myths in form only. In practice, they are instructions, honed by repetition, and handed down until they stop sounding like fear and start sounding like common sense. That is often how myth behaves around real danger. It does not separate the mysterious from the practical. It binds them together. The giant snake becomes larger than life precisely because life with it requires constant attention. Fear gives it weight. Fascination gives it reach. Story gives it memory. And once a creature has accumulated all of that, once it has become not just a predator but a symbol, and a warning and a point of argument, a modern society eventually does what modern societies always do. It tries to answer the problem with tools, plans, systems and force. Admiration and folklore only take you so far when livestock are disappearing, roads are crossing marshes, and people want reassurance that the old giant can, at the very least, be tracked, contained, or stopped when necessary. And that's the point where admiration starts reaching for equipment. Once a creature becomes real enough to threaten livestock, reshape wetlands, unsettle transport routes, and occasionally remind people that riverbanks are not a human right, modern society does what it always does. It begins asking whether the problem can be managed with technology, planning and force. Not always wisely, not always calmly, and certainly not always with enough respect for the landscape involved. But the question comes anyway. Could we contain it? Could we track it? Could we stop it when necessary? Could science and modern weapons keep Titanoboa from becoming a standing crisis in the hotter parts of the world? The first answer is simple enough to be disappointing. We could control individual situations far more effectively than any earlier society could. We could respond faster, investigate better, gather data more accurately, and kill or capture specific animals when circumstances demanded it. But full containment, in the strict and satisfying sense people usually mean, would be much harder than they would hope. Not impossible everywhere, not hopeless in all cases, but far less tidy than the phrase modern weapons and science tends to suggest. Science, to begin with, would be extremely good at understanding Titanoboa once it had enough access. That part would be impressive. We could sample DNA from water using environmental traces, track thermal signatures with drones in some conditions, fit transmitters to captured animals, map high-risk habitat, study movement patterns, estimate prey use through isotopes, model likely breeding zones, analyse basking behaviour, and predict seasonal rain shifts with considerable accuracy in the best monitored regions. If the question is whether modern science could learn the habits of Titanoboa, the answer is yes, and rather quickly by the standards of field biology. Once a few individuals were followed closely, the broad logic of the species would begin to reveal itself. But learning an animal is not the same as containing it. This is a distinction humans repeatedly underestimate. We know a great deal about sharks, crocodiles, elephants, wolves, and big cats. That knowledge does not place them neatly inside human preferences. Science can make conflict more manageable, but it does not turn living systems into obedient diagrams. Titanoboa would be especially resistant to that fantasy because its likely habitat would work so actively against total oversight. Dense tropical wetlands are not cooperative places. They distort signals, hide movement, swallow equipment, disrupt visibility, and change shape with season and flood. A field biologist can map a marsh in 1 month and return later to find half the meaningful paths underwater, newly exposed or shifted into entirely different channels. Titanoboa would not be living in a zoo enclosure with politely labelled corners. It would be living in the sort of habitat that makes certainty tired. Still, let us give modern science its due. Environmental DNA would be one of the first major tools, and a powerful one. By sampling water from different channels, oxbow lakes, floodplain pools and marsh drains, researchers could detect the presence of Titanoboa even when direct sightings remained rare. That would help identify active range, detect movement into new systems, and perhaps even monitor breeding concentration areas if shedding, mating or nesting behaviour produced enough biological trace. In public imagination, science often means seeing everything. In practice, it often means detecting enough traces to infer where something has been. For a secretive giant wetland snake, that would already be a remarkable advantage. Radio telemetry and satellite-linked tags would also matter, though they would come with serious limits. Capturing and instrumenting a young or sub-adult Titanoboa would be difficult but manageable for a trained team with proper equipment, sedation protocols, and a healthy respect for not standing in the wrong place during the process. Instrumenting a full adult would be another matter. A snake that large would be physically dangerous even when partly restrained. Its body mass, muscular force, and sensitivity to heat stress during handling would all complicate the work. Researchers would have to immobilise it carefully, quickly, and with veterinary support. Even then, transmitters would not solve everything. Signals fail in dense wetlands. Equipment gets damaged. Tagged animals disappear into areas impossible to access for days or weeks. A handful of tracked individuals could reveal a great deal, but they would not turn the entire population transparent. Drones would be another obvious tool, and very useful in some contexts. Thermal drones could detect basking or recently active snakes along exposed banks, especially at dawn, dusk, or on cooler mornings when temperature contrast helped. Standard imaging drones could inspect sandbars, shallow crossings, and known conflict sites without sending humans directly into the reeds. In open wetlands, this could reduce risk substantially. In flooded forest under closed canopy, however, drones would be far less magical than the public would imagine. Trees block sight, water reflects and confuses, heat signatures blend. Battery life does not improve simply because the situation is urgent. A drone can help confirm a snake in a corridor or on a bank. It cannot by itself empty a whole marsh of uncertainty. Camera traps would help in narrower places. Culverts, crossings, levee gaps, cattle access points, drainage lines, and game trails near water could be monitored with impressive persistence. Over time, this would build a better picture of movement timing and hotspot use. If Titanoboa behaved like many ambush specialists, certain points in the landscape would matter far more than others. Science would find those points. That would be one of the great practical strengths of modern ecology. We might not see every snake, but we would become very good at recognizing where snakes were most likely to appear. Once that happened, response teams, warning systems, and local safety planning could become much more effective. And yet, even with all of that, there would remain a stubborn truth. Detection is never total, especially in warm, wet, plant-heavy environments built by evolution for concealment. If one Titanoboa chose to remain in a complicated channel system and had no recent conflict with people, no reason to bask openly, and no tag transmitting its location, it could remain functionally uncontained for a very long time. Science would narrow the fog, not eliminate it. That is where weapons enter the conversation, and the public usually grows much more confident than the field teams do. Could modern firearms kill Titanoboa? Of course they could. A sufficiently powerful rifle, used accurately and in the right conditions, could kill even a very large constrictor. Heavy caliber weapons, precision shots to the brain or upper spinal region, and concentrated fire from trained personnel would all be capable of stopping an individual animal. People often want a dramatic answer here, as though Titanoboa's scale might somehow make it bulletproof through sheer bad manners. It would not. Flesh remains flesh, bone remains bone. A giant snake would be difficult, dangerous, and physically formidable, but not invulnerable to modern ballistics. The harder question is whether firearms would be a reliable containment strategy in the field, and here the answer becomes much less comforting. To kill a Titanoboa cleanly and safely, one must first find it clearly enough to identify the vital target area, approach or observe without being charged into water or cover, avoid striking the wrong animal in dense habitat, avoid injuring nearby people or livestock, and do all this while the snake is often partly submerged, partly concealed, moving unpredictably, or wrapped around something everyone would prefer remained unwrapped. That is a very different matter from imagining a clear-side profile on a firing range. Wetlands do not stage good shooting conditions as a courtesy to response teams. They stage confusion. A giant constrictor half in black water, half under roots, is a difficult target even before one begins considering ricochet, partial visibility, and the consequences of merely wounding it. Wounding would be a major problem. An injured Titanoboa retreating into deep cover could become harder to locate, more dangerous to approach, and more likely to die slowly in inaccessible habitat. That would be bad ethically, bad for safety, and bad for science if authorities were trying to understand or manage the local population. So while lethal force would absolutely be possible, professional teams would try very hard not to rely on improvised shooting as the default solution. Rural communities, unfortunately, would not always have the luxury of waiting for professional teams, which is how many messy conflicts begin. What about heavier weapons? Could military hardware contain Titanoboa if governments decided enough was enough? In a narrow sense, yes. Armoured vehicles, helicopters, thermal imaging, heavy caliber machine guns, explosives, even flame-based clearing operations could devastate a local area and kill large snakes within it. But once a society reaches the point of using battlefield methods to manage wildlife in a tropical wetland, the word contain has become suspiciously close to ruin. Heavy force would damage habitat, kill non-target animals, disrupt communities, ignite political backlash, and likely fail to eliminate every individual unless the area involved were quite small. You can devastate a marsh. That does not mean you have intelligently solved what lived in it. And if the goal is not extermination but containment, then science would still matter more than firepower. Modern wildlife management is strongest when it shapes contact rather than pretending it can erase the species. That would be the sensible strategy with Titanoboa. Not kill them all, which would be ecologically disastrous and practically difficult across a broad tropical range, but reduce high-risk encounters, protect human life, secure key infrastructure, and maintain the species in controlled landscapes where possible. It is a less emotionally satisfying answer than many people would want, but it is the one reality usually prefers. Containment, then, would likely involve layers rather than one dramatic solution. High-risk areas near settlements would be monitored intensely. Livestock access to wetlands would be redesigned. Children would be kept from known channels. Night travel by boat through certain corridors might be restricted seasonally. Early warning systems based on tagged individuals, eDNA, spikes, drone sweeps and local reports could trigger temporary closures of crossings or fishing zones. Response teams trained in capture, sedation, and relocation would be stationed in major conflict regions. Protected core habitats would be managed differently from human use edges. In essence, humanity would try to contain the interaction rather than the entire species. Sedation would play a role, though again, not as cleanly as the public would hope. Tranquilizing a giant snake sounds straightforward until one remembers that the animal is very large, very muscular, likely near water, and not inclined to remain helpfully still while pharmacology catches up. Drug dosage in massive reptiles can be tricky. Too little and the animal escapes, now annoyed and harder to track. Too much and the animal risks respiratory collapse, overheating, drowning, or prolonged recovery complications. Delivering the sedative reliably through thick muscle at safe range in wetland conditions is its own challenge. Recapture teams would need boats, poles, restraint gear, veterinary oversight, cooling strategies, and considerable experience. It could be done. It would not be pretty, quick, or routine in the way popular imagination likes to imagine rescue operations. Relocation would also sound better than it worked. Moving a conflict Titanoboa from a farm edge to a protected wetland might solve one immediate problem. But if the new area already held dominant adults, the newcomer might be forced into further movement and new conflict. If returned to marginal habitat, it might come back. If moved too far, the stress and ecological mismatch could kill it, or cause unpredictable behaviour. Relocation is often treated as a magical compromise between fear and conscience. In practice, it is a complicated negotiation with animal behaviour, geography, and the fact that a giant predator does not always appreciate being assigned a new address. Barriers could help in some places. Snake-proof fencing around specific assets such as schools, livestock pens, water treatment sites, or road approaches might reduce incidents locally, especially if combined with vegetation clearing and proper maintenance. But fencing entire wetland regions would be absurd, ecologically damaging, and financially ruinous. Titanoboa would not be managed behind one giant perimeter. It would be managed by selectively hardening human spaces and leaving wild spaces wild enough to hold it away from constant contact. This is how modern coexistence with large predators usually works when it works at all. We do not contain the whole wolf in the forest. We contain the sheep more effectively. The same logic would apply here, only with rather more water and a stronger need to inspect culverts carefully before declaring the problem solved. Science would also help through behaviour prediction. If researchers learned that Titanoboa used certain habitats heavily during breeding, or moved during particular flood phases, or basked after major feeding events in recognisable spots, then managers could focus efforts around those patterns. A snake that is predictable part of the year is easier to avoid, easier to detect and easier to manage than one treated as a pure force of chaos. This would be one of the quieter victories of modern ecology. Not a dramatic conquest, but a reduction in uncertainty. Over time, communities would learn the species the way sailors learn currents, or mountain towns learn avalanche paths. Science would refine that local knowledge and make it portable. Dangerous, yes. Mysterious, less so. Still, there would always be limits built into the animal's biology and habitat. Titanoboa would not need to move daily through the open. It could remain still for long periods. It could feed and then withdraw. It could use water to support its mass and conceal its approach. It could move through channels that machines handle poorly. It could vanish into exactly the places where line of sight, radio signal, road access, and human confidence all begin to fray. In other words, even a well-studied Titanoboa population would remain only partly containable. That would frustrate governments enormously. The military and police dimensions would become particularly tense after attacks on people. Following a confirmed fatality, political pressure would surge. Local residents would demand removals or killings. National media would ask why a giant prehistoric predator was still being tolerated near transport corridors or settlements. Officials would promise action. Special teams would deploy. Some animals would be killed. Others would be captured. Drone sweeps would multiply. Yet after the urgency faded, the underlying landscape would remain. Marshes would still flood. Prey would still move. Warm channels would still connect. And somewhere beyond the temporary security zone, more Titanoboas would still exist. This is the essential frustration of trying to solve habitat-scale problems with incident-scale force. Even the idea of containing the species would split into two very different meanings. Conservationist would mean keeping the population viable within designated protected ecosystems and preventing expansion into high-conflict zones. Some security-minded officials would mean suppressing it around human infrastructure and reducing density near people. Some frightened communities would mean removing it entirely from their district. These are not the same goal, and they would clash repeatedly. Science could inform the debate. Weapons could enforce parts of one side. Neither would make the conflict disappear. Climate would complicate matters further. If the world warmed enough to make some areas more suitable and others less predictable in their flood regime, Titanoboa's distribution might shift over time. Science could forecast that to a degree, but containment plans would always be playing catch-up. A corridor once considered marginal might become active. A reservoir fringe might suddenly support prey-rich conditions. A dry-year refuge might become a regular node in movement. Human infrastructure once thought secure might find itself newly adjacent to snake movement routes after a decade of changed rainfall. In that sense, modern science would be valuable not because it could freeze the system in place, but because it could keep telling us how the old giant was responding to the new world we kept building around it. And there is something humbling in that. We like to imagine modern tools as the final answer to old dangers, but most of our success with dangerous wildlife comes not from overpowering it absolutely, but from understanding enough to stop making stupid contact so often. That would be true here as well. Titanoboa would not be beyond the reach of rifles, drones, sedatives, fences, data models, and trained response units. Individual animals could absolutely be stopped. Specific zones could be made much safer. Certain river crossings could be monitored so well that surprise encounters became rare. Yet the species as a whole, spread through major tropical wetlands, backed by heat, cover, prey, and the logic of ambush, would remain more resilient than any single weapon system. So if the real question is whether modern weapons and science could contain Titanoboa completely, the answer is no, not in the clean absolute way the word suggests. We could reduce risk. We could map it. We could move it in some cases and kill it in others. We could defend roads, farms, schools, docks and towns more effectively than any earlier human society could. We could even push the species out of some heavily contested regions. But we could not fully domesticate the problem without either exterminating the animal across vast landscapes or transforming those landscapes so aggressively that countless other species and human communities would pay the price with it. And that is where the balance becomes most uncomfortable. Because if a creature cannot be fully contained, then the real question is no longer only about defense. It becomes a question of consequence. What does the world around it look like if it stays? What does it change in prey, in competition, in river life, in the behaviour of everything that shares its wetlands? Once the conversation moves past fear and force, it arrives at ecology, and ecology is where the giant snake's true weight would probably be felt most of all. Once the question of weapons and containment begins to cool down, another question takes its place, and in many ways it is the deeper one. Not whether we could stop Titanoboa in particular situations, but what the living presence of such an animal would actually do to the wider world around it. Because large predators are never just large predators. They are pressures, they are editors, they are forces that decide, often very quietly, where other animals go, when they move, what risks they take, and how the landscape itself begins to feel. A giant snake surviving into the present would not simply occupy wetlands as one more dramatic resident. It would rearrange them. That rearrangement would begin with prey, because prey is where most ecosystem changes first become visible. If Titanoboa lived in major tropical wetland systems today, then every species regularly vulnerable to it would move through those systems differently. Capybaras would not use banks casually. Deer would alter crossings. Wild pigs would change their routes to water. Caimans, especially younger ones, would use certain channels more cautiously. Nesting birds would avoid some marsh edges during the most dangerous periods. In short, Titanoboa would create a geography of hesitation. That sort of effect is easy to underestimate because it does not always appear as piles of bodies. People often think predators change ecosystems simply by eating a lot of things. They do that certainly, but their more subtle power lies in changing behaviour. If prey animals start avoiding productive feeding grounds because the approach to those grounds is too dangerous, then vegetation changes. If they cluster in safer but poorer areas, grazing pressure shifts. If animals approach water at different times or in different group sizes, then competition changes, disease exposure changes, breeding success changes, and the simple rhythm of daily life in the wetland begins to move to a different beat. Titanoboa would be especially powerful in this regard because it would dominate the exact places where many animals have no choice but to go sooner or later. The edges, the crossings, the drinking sites, the shallow margins, the channels between feeding zones. That is one reason giant ambush predators can have such a disproportionate influence relative to how often they are actually seen. They do not need to chase everything constantly. They only need to make enough of the landscape feel uncertain that other species stop treating it casually. Titanoboa would do that at scale. In some wetland systems, it might effectively turn broad sections of riverbank into high-risk space. Not forbidden space, because life still has to drink, cross, nest and forage, but space that carries a different cost. Over time, that cost would ripple outward through the food web. Vegetation would feel the effects first in places where herbivores had to reconsider their routines. Imagine a floodplain where capybaras and deer once fed freely along certain grassy or shrubby edges. Add a giant constrictor that reliably hunts those margins, and the prey species begin favouring more open, more visible, or otherwise less risky sites. That means some bank vegetation gets a reprieve. Other areas, the safer ones, get heavier browsing. In a wetland, even small changes in grazing pressure can matter. Plant communities shift. Seedlings that once vanished may survive. Reed beds may thicken in one place and thin in another. Floating vegetation may accumulate differently if the animals that once moved through it begin avoiding those channels. The ecosystem does not need to be dramatically transformed overnight. It only needs enough repeated nudges for patterns to drift. Titanoboa would also influence other predators, which is often where ecosystems become especially interesting. In its preferred habitats, it would not be alone. Jaguars, caimans, large anacondas, birds of prey, smaller snakes, scavengers, and a long list of opportunists would already be making a living in the same broad system. A giant snake of Titanoboa's scale would not replace all of them, but it would force them to adjust. Jaguars, for instance, might avoid some water margins used heavily by Titanoboa, particularly when hunting medium-sized mammals near channels, not because jaguars are timid, but because even a powerful cat benefits little from getting entangled with something that large in poor footing near deep water. Caimans would have an even more complicated relationship with it. Large adult caimans might remain formidable in many contexts, but juveniles and subadults would face a new level of pressure, especially in quieter channels and sidewaters. That could reduce caiman density in some habitats, shift nursery areas, and alter the age structure of local crocodilian populations. Anacondas would likely be affected as well, perhaps quite strongly in places of overlap. A giant surviving Titanoboa would not merely compete with them for prey. It could outcompete them in certain size classes and perhaps even prey on younger or smaller individuals when opportunity allowed. That does not mean anacondas would vanish everywhere Titanoboa lived. Ecosystems are rarely so neat, but their distribution, growth patterns and use of breeding habitat could all shift in response to the presence of a larger and more dominant constrictor. In some wetlands, Titanoboa might effectively occupy the upper end of the snake niche in such a decisive way that anacondas become more tied to secondary habitats, smaller prey, or regions where the giant relic is absent. This sort of top-level pressure tends to create room elsewhere. If Titanoboa suppresses some mid to large predators in certain habitats, then smaller predators may either expand into the gaps or suffer from the increased unpredictability of prey behaviour. Some mesopredators might benefit if caimans or anacondas are reduced. Others might struggle because prey species stop using certain areas altogether. Wetlands are not simple ladders. They're crowded negotiations. Introduce an ancient snake capable of moving prey and competitors around, and you would get a system that is not merely more dangerous but more uneven. Scavengers would benefit in some ways. A giant constrictor does not always consume every part of every kill under ideal conditions. Large prey taken in water or dragged into cover may leave remains accessible to fish, turtles, birds, insects and mammals. A Titanoboa-killed capybara, deer, or caiman could feed a great many lesser lives after the snake had taken what it needed. In that way, the animal would not just remove biomass from the system, it would redistribute it. Nutrients would move from one part of the wetland to another through kills, digestion, excretion, and carcass remains. This matters more than it first appears. Large predators are not only consumers, they are transporters of energy. They move death, and death is often where ecosystems get their work done. Its shedding, breeding, and nesting behaviour would matter too. Large snakes leave behind skin, waste, disturbed vegetation, compressed resting sites, and in some cases concentrated breeding activity. A breeding zone used repeatedly over years by big individuals would become a kind of ecological node. Scavengers would inspect it. Smaller animals would avoid it. Researchers would be very interested in it, though they might prefer someone else to step in first. Even basking sites could become significant. If Titanoboa repeatedly used specific sandbars, banks, or forest gaps to thermoregulate after feeding, then those sites would carry a peculiar ecological gravity. Other animals would learn them, some would avoid them. Some might exploit the occasional remains or insects concentrated around them. The snake's body, in other words, would begin shaping place memory across species. Water systems themselves might change in smaller but still meaningful ways, not because Titanoboa would engineer rivers directly in the way a beaver engineers streams, but because repeated use of certain access points, bank hollows, basking shelves, and submerged roots would modify the microstructure of some wetland margins. Heavy bodies moving through mud and vegetation do leave marks. Over time, frequently used slide paths might become semi-permanent channels through reeds and floating plants. Bank cavities might enlarge. Resting depressions might persist in soft ground. These would not be grand landscape transformations visible from orbit, but they would become part of the fine-grained architecture of Titanoboa country. Other animals would notice them, use them, or avoid them. Fish communities could be affected both directly and indirectly. Directly, Titanoboa would likely take fish at times, especially large or concentrated ones. Indirectly, changes in the behaviour of birds, caimans, otters, turtles and mammals along water margins would alter fish nursery zones, predation patterns and disturbance regimes. If prey mammals avoided certain crossings and used fewer entry points to water, trampling and nutrient input might become more concentrated elsewhere. If caimans were less common in some side channels because Titanoboa dominated them, fish survival in those channels might increase for a time, unless the snake itself or other predators filled the gap differently. Ecosystems rarely reward single-cause thinking. Every effect drags three others behind it. Bird life would also shift. Ground-nesting species near wetlands would face another major predator. Wading birds using shallow feeding zones might alter colony placement if giant snakes patrolled their routes often enough. Birds that rely on prey stirred up by mammal movement near marsh edges could find those patterns changing. Large constrictors do not only affect the species they consume, they affect the species that depend on the movement of the species they consume. A flock of birds following capybaras through shallow marsh does not just care whether the capybaras survive, it cares whether capybaras dare to walk. In that sense, Titanoboa would create what ecologists sometimes describe through fear-mediated effects, though the phrase sounds a bit too clinical for how dramatic the reality would feel on the ground. Animals would live differently because the possibility of giant constriction at the bank never fully leaves the calculation. A capybara herd entering water is not only deciding whether the water is deep or the grass is good, it is deciding whether this stretch of life still belongs to ordinary caution or to the ancient rules. There's also the matter of density. If Titanoboa remained rare, as large predators often are, its effects might be highly concentrated around certain habitats, but still significant overall because those habitats are biologically important. A single breeding female or dominant adult in the wrong channel could influence movement across a surprisingly large surrounding area. Wetlands often revolve around choke points. You do not need predators everywhere if the prey must eventually funnel somewhere. Titanoboa would likely exploit exactly those funnels, which means its ecological weight could exceed its numerical abundance. This would matter very much in dry seasons. As water shrank, the system would tighten. Fish would crowd into residual pools. Mammals would converge on reliable drinking points. Birds would gather at exposed feeding zones. Reptiles would use the remaining channels more intensely. In those moments, Titanoboa could become a major seasonal shaper of the wetland. Not because it suddenly multiplied, but because the whole ecosystem contracted toward the places where it was already most dangerous. Seasonal bottlenecks magnify predators. A giant snake living through the dry pulse of the tropics would become, for weeks or months at a time, a far more active editor of life than annual population averages might suggest. That editing could have stabilizing effects in some systems. Large herbivores and omnivores, unchecked, can overuse productive margins. Mid-level predators can sometimes become too abundant in fragmented or disturbed landscapes. An apex or near-apex constrictor could suppress some of those pressures, helping maintain a more complex and cautious ecosystem. It might reduce overconcentration of certain prey species in wetland edges. It might limit the expansion of invasive or overabundant animals in human-modified systems, especially where domestic escapees or feral pigs begin altering marsh vegetation. A giant predator is not automatically a catastrophe for biodiversity. In some cases, it is part of the reason biodiversity remains dynamic and structurally rich. But the modern world would complicate that benefit. Human-modified ecosystems are not balanced in the way prehistoric wet systems might have been. Farms, roads, canals, dams, poaching, invasive species, livestock, pollution, and habitat fragmentation all distort the baseline. In such altered landscapes, Titanoboa's ecological role could become warped. It might lean more heavily on domestic prey in some places, altering its pressure on wild species. It might be excluded from key breeding wetlands and concentrated into smaller refuges where its effects become locally intense. It might suppress some predators while failing to control others thriving in disturbed zones. In short, it would still be ecologically powerful, but the pattern of that power would be uneven and often shaped by the damage humans had already done. There is another uncomfortable point here. If Titanoboa survived into the present, it would likely become one of the very few terrestrial or semi-aquatic predators capable of significantly influencing the behaviour of very large wetland animals in ways humans could easily notice. That would make it ecologically important and psychologically impossible to ignore. Some areas might remain more densely vegetated along banks precisely because prey stopped lingering there. Some channels might show fewer juvenile caimans. Some floodplain pastures near reserve edges might become unsafe for cattle, not because the grass changed, but because the old food web had returned to the surface and reminded everyone that pasture is still only a temporary human interpretation of marsh. Its interactions with human economies would therefore become part of the ecosystem story as well. A predator taking livestock near wetlands changes grazing patterns. Ranchers fence more aggressively. Vegetation is cleared back from water. Dogs are introduced. Boats increase. Patrols move in. Those changes in turn affect birds, amphibians, insects, smaller mammals, and aquatic vegetation. Titanoboa would not just affect ecosystems directly, it would affect them through the human reaction to its presence. This often happens with large predators. The ecological footprint of fear is not limited to prey, it includes land management. In some areas, the snake's greatest ecosystem effect might come through the lengths people go to avoid it. Protected areas would see particularly interesting consequences. In a reserve large enough to hold a viable Titanoboa population, the species could help maintain older wetland patterns that might otherwise soften under reduced predation pressure. Prey species would move more. Mid-level predators would remain in check in some zones. Certain bank habitats might stay less heavily grazed. The reserve would feel older in its logic, less arranged around easy access. Rangers, researchers and tourists would all have to treat some waters differently. This may sound inconvenient, and it would be, but ecological inconvenience is often another name for integrity. A wetland that still belongs partly to a giant predator is not a simplified system. Of course, if Titanoboa were lost from one region and survived in another, the contrast between those ecosystems might become very revealing. Scientists would compare prey behaviour, vegetation patterns, predator communities, and nutrient dynamics in snake-present and snake-absent systems. They would likely find that the absence of such a large constrictor leaves a measurable quietness in the structure of wetland risk. Water access becomes easier. Certain prey use edges more heavily. Some mesopredators expand. Some vegetation is cropped harder. The whole place becomes, in ecological terms, slightly less tense. Humans often prefer such landscapes because they are easier to move through. Nature does not always prefer them for the same reason. There would also be a climate dimension. Titanoboa, as a giant ectotherm, would be unusually sensitive to temperature patterns. In warming tropical regions, it might gain access to some habitats formerly too marginal. That could expand its ecological influence into wetlands that had previously escaped it. In other regions, changes in rainfall or flood timing could make key habitats less stable, reducing its impact or concentrating it into remnant strongholds. The result would be a moving ecological frontier, one where the species' influence waxed and waned not just with conservation policy, but with climate itself. In that way, Titanoboa would become both a driver and a signal of ecosystem change. Where it thrives, one kind of tropical wetland world still holds. Where it fades, another kind is taking over. And then there is the simple but profound effect of time. A species like this does not need to remake the world in one generation. It only needs to persist long enough for every other species to learn it. Over decades and centuries, prey adaptations could sharpen. Breeding seasons might shift slightly in some animals to reduce overlap with peak snake activity. Nest placement could change. Movement corridors could become culturally inherited among herd animals and social species. Titanoboa would become part of the evolutionary conversation again, not only the ecological one. Life around it would begin remembering the giant through selection, habit, and learning. That may be the most important thing of all. A living Titanoboa would not just be another big predator inserted into an existing chart. It would restore an older dimension of pressure to ecosystems that, in many places, no longer expect to host something quite so massive, patient and physically decisive. It would make some wetlands behave less like managed nature and more like serious country again. Not untouched, not pure, not some fantasy of the primordial, but governed in part by a body old enough to remind everything else that the riverbank was never guaranteed to be a safe and neutral line. So what would Titanoboa do to Earth's ecosystems? It would tighten them. It would move fear through them. It would redistribute prey, alter predator hierarchies, protect some vegetation by making it costly to graze, feed scavengers through enormous kills, and turn certain channels, banks and crossing points into places of consequence. In some systems, it might preserve complexity. In others, it might intensify the already difficult collision between ancient food webs and modern land use. Everywhere it lived, it would make the wetland feel more alive in the least comfortable and most ecologically honest sense. And that leaves us with the final human question, the one all the others have been leaning toward without quite saying so directly. If such a creature truly remained among us, if the world still contained one enormous reminder that deep time had not entirely stepped aside, then the issue would no longer be just science, fear, or ecosystem theory. It would be something more intimate than that. It would be the question of daily life itself, of what it means to build homes, raise children, cross rivers, farm floodplains, and sleep at night in a world that still, in some places, belonged to giants. And that is where the whole thought experiment finally becomes personal. Up to now, it has been possible to keep Titanoboa at a useful distance. We could speak about habitat, prey, roads, cameras, ecology, and all the other respectable things that make a giant prehistoric snake sound like a topic for researchers, officials, and the sort of documentary narrator who wears sturdy boots and somehow never seems sweaty. But the real question was always closer than that. What would it actually feel like to live in a world where Titanoboa had never truly gone away? Not to study it, not to argue about it from a capital city, not to watch it from a safe seat with subtitles and a cup of tea, to live with it, to raise a family near its range, to build roads and houses and schools in places where the old rules of the wetland still included one enormous silent constrictor. That would change daily life first, and philosophy second. People often imagine that living near a giant predator must be a constant state of panic, but that is rarely how humans actually function. Constant panic is exhausting and impractical. What people develop instead is routine caution. Routine caution is much more durable. It settles into the bones of a place. It decides where the path goes, when the animals are brought in, how close children are allowed to stand to the water, and which bank is avoided even when it looks perfectly harmless in the afternoon sun. In a world where Titanoboa still lived, entire regions would be organised around that kind of knowledge. Not fear in the dramatic sense, but respect enforced by repetition. Children would learn it early, probably before they understood the scientific name or the fossil history or the arguments about conservation status. They would learn it the way children learn the dangerous facts of any landscape they grow up in. Do not put your hands there. Do not wander off that track. Do not go near the reeds alone. Do not swim in certain waters. Do not assume stillness means safety. Adults would not need to perform this knowledge theatrically. They would teach it the same way people teach road sense, fire sense, or storm sense. Calmly, often, and without debate. There would be households where a child asking to play near a flood channel would get the same look another child gets for asking to juggle knives in the kitchen. Not outrage. Just immediate refusal based on experience too old to be discussed every time. That is one of the odd things about danger. Once it stays long enough, it becomes infrastructure. You would see that in settlement patterns. Villages, towns and rural homesteads in Titanoboa country would not be placed at random. They would cluster on higher ground, firmer banks, clearer shorelines, or places where access to water could be controlled without inviting too much trouble. Boat landings would be built differently. Livestock pens would be set farther back from marsh edges. Schools and clinics would avoid low, overgrown margins. A strip of cleared ground between habitation and water would not be just a bit of useful open space. It would be a safety line. Fences would matter. Lighting would matter. Raised walkways in flood zones would matter. Even something as ordinary as where a household washed clothes, filled containers, or cleaned fish would be shaped by the possibility that one section of shoreline was public life, and another section was still, very clearly, the river's own business. Road design would reflect the same caution. In regions where Titanoboa moved through wetlands seasonally, bridges might be longer, embankments steeper, culverts more carefully monitored, and roadside vegetation cleared farther back near known crossing points. Night driving warnings would be common in lowland flood country. Not because every road would be crawling with giant snakes, but because enough encounters would have happened over enough years to turn local engineering into a kind of quiet agreement with the land. You do not build certain things cheaply in Titanoboa country, because if you do, the correction arrives later and usually with paperwork, repair costs, and a deeply unpleasant explanation to the press. Farm life would be changed even more directly. Ranchers and smallholders living near wetlands would organise their routines around the animal in ways outsiders might find surprising until they spent a single dry season near a cattle pond. Watering livestock at open marsh edges would be seen as lazy or reckless unless the bank had been cleared and secured properly. Night corralling would be standard in some areas. Dogs would be valued not only as guards but as early warning animals, though not all dogs would be wise enough to survive long careers in such work. Some breeds might become regionally favoured because they barked early and kept their distance, instead of charging into reeds with heroic but unhelpful confidence. Farmers would discuss snake activity the way others discuss weather. Fresh slides by the West Pond, one seen near the old crossing last week. Do not send the calves down there. Move them to the upper paddock. Ordinary sentences in an extraordinary landscape. Fishing communities would develop perhaps the most refined daily relationship with Titanoboa, because they would spend so much time in the animal's preferred world. Boat design, travel times, net setting routines, and even where one stopped to rest or relieve oneself would be shaped by long practice. Certain channels would be avoided at dawn or dusk in dry months. Some reed fringe pools would be treated as if they were privately owned by the snake, because in practical terms they were. People would still fish, still travel, still work. That is important to remember. Human beings do not simply abandon useful landscapes because danger lives there. They learn to work around the danger until it becomes part of the trade. But the trade changes, the rhythm changes, the jokes change. Every working life develops its own vocabulary for risk, and Titanoboa would be firmly inside that vocabulary. Cities near its range would express the relationship differently. Urban people often live close to dangerous landscapes without engaging them every day. Their sense of the animal would be mediated through news, warning signs, official advisories, and the occasional spectacular sighting that interrupts the illusion of separation. In a river city near Titanoboa habitat, most residents might go months or years without thinking about it much at all, right up until a monsoon flood or drought pushed one into a drainage canal, a reservoir fringe, or a vegetated industrial backwater, and the whole city remembered in one nervous afternoon that the surrounding lowlands were not, in fact, decorative. This is how large animals often exist in modern imagination. Absent until suddenly impossible to ignore. That tension would shape culture in ways both small and large. Real estate closer to certain wetlands would be cheaper, unless it had excellent barriers and prestige strong enough to overrule biology. Parents would warn teenagers away from night dares near marsh roads the way other parents warn against drink driving or cliff jumping. Insurance policies in some districts would quietly account for large predator risk, without ever putting it on the brochure in friendly print. Schools would teach wetland safety the way coastal regions teach rip currents, or earthquake zones teach drills. Children would learn that do not approach the bank is not an overreaction. It is just Tuesday. The emotional effect would be interesting too. A world with Titanoboa still in it would feel, in certain places, less fully conquered. That is not a mystical statement. It is an administrative one. Human beings feel safest when landscapes can be reduced to schedules, routes, drainage plans, and emergency numbers. Titanoboa would resist that reduction. Not everywhere, not all the time, but enough to keep some environments from becoming fully ordinary. A boardwalk through a marsh might still be a boardwalk, a ferry crossing might still run on time, a flood levee might still look reassuring in daylight. Yet beneath all of it would be the knowledge that some parts of the map were not just difficult or remote. They were actively inhabited by something large enough, old enough, and quiet enough to make confidence look a little childish. For some people, that would be deeply uncomfortable. For others, strangely grounding. There are always people who respond to powerful animals not with hatred or fear alone, but with a certain kind of relief. A relief that not everything has been made small, safe, and measurable. A living Titanoboa would offer that feeling in abundance, especially to people who already believe the modern world had become too flat in spirit and too eager to fence every mystery into manageable exhibits. There would be artists, naturalists, conservationists, and local thinkers who regarded the snake not as a problem to be solved, but as proof that the world still retained some old authority. That does not mean they would want it under the porch, obviously. Appreciation has reasonable boundaries, but they would resist any attempt to speak of the species purely as a hazard. To them, Titanoboa would be one of the last strong reminders that life on Earth was never arranged for human convenience. That perspective would collide naturally with the perfectly understandable views of people who actually lost livestock or knew someone injured in snake country. And that collision would shape politics. Every society that lives alongside dangerous wildlife eventually divides into familiar camps. Those who want stricter control, those who want stronger protections, those who want compensation, those who want better education, those who live far away and speak grandly, those who live nearby and speak plainly. Titanoboa would intensify all of this because it would be hard to speak moderately about an animal that large. Moderation is easier with wolves. It becomes more difficult with something that makes a canoe look temporary. Still, coexistence would not be impossible. That is important. Difficult, yes. Uneven, certainly. But not impossible. Humans already coexist with animals that can kill them, sometimes efficiently. Crocodiles, elephants, bears, big cats, venomous snakes, sharks, hippos. Coexistence never means comfort. It means systems. It means habits, compensation schemes, exclusion zones, warning networks, community knowledge, and a continual argument over what level of risk is tolerable. Titanoboa would fit that pattern, though it would push it harder than most species do because its combination of rarity, size, and habitat would make it both ecologically important and emotionally unforgettable. There would be places where coexistence worked reasonably well because people knew the rules and habitats remained intact enough to keep most conflict at the edges. There would be other places where habitat loss and poverty turned every encounter into a disaster waiting to be televised. The species would not produce one global lesson. It would produce many local ones, some admirable and some bleak. Tourism would complicate this in a very modern way. Some regions would try to benefit economically from Titanoboa's presence, and one can hardly blame them. People will pay astonishing sums to glimpse danger from a platform with railings, carefully managed viewing hides, boat tours through known safe channels, museums, interpretation centres, research stations with visitor programs, perhaps even seasonal festivals celebrating river culture and giant wildlife. All of this could help local economies and strengthen conservation. It could also go badly wrong if too much confidence and not enough common sense entered the arrangement. Somewhere, at some point, someone would absolutely lean too far over the rail for a better photograph. Human beings are many wonderful things. Reliably sensible near famous predators is not always one of them. The presence of Titanoboa would also affect imagination at a much younger age than politics or tourism. Children growing up in such a world would have a different baseline for what the planet contains. That matters more than people think. To us, a giant prehistoric snake surviving into the modern era feels like a rupture in the ordinary arrangement of time. To them, it would simply be part of Earth. Just another fact, though admittedly an unusually long one. They would not need to be persuaded that ancient lineages endure. They would not speak of the prehistoric as something cleanly separate from the present. In school, they might learn about dinosaurs, ice age mammals and ancient seas, then go home to a part of the world where one very old rule still swam through the drainage basin after heavy rain. That would produce a different sense of history, less shelf-like, less tidy, more continuous. And perhaps that is the deepest change of all. Living in a world that still belonged to giants would alter how humans thought about their place in time, not just their place in space. Modern life encourages a very flattering story about ourselves. We like to imagine that we arrived at the end of the process, after the age of giant reptiles, after the age of monstrous scales and oversized appetites, after the truly dramatic phases of Earth had settled down enough for us to install glass doors, drainage systems and conference centres. Titanoboa would interrupt that story every time it surfaced. It would say, in the bluntest possible biological terms, that the grand untidy world was not entirely over, that some of the old scale remained, that modernity had not erased everything large enough to humble it. That would not make daily life worse in some universal sense. For many people far from its range, Titanoboa would remain an idea, a documentary animal, a headline, a museum display, a reason to keep one's holiday plans inland. For those who lived near it, life would still contain breakfast, gossip, school runs, repairs, fishing, football, marriages, paperwork, boredom, and all the other ordinary things that continue quite stubbornly in every dangerous landscape on Earth. Human life does not become mythic simply because myth-sized animals live nearby. It becomes more careful, more specific, more aware of edges. That is different. There would also be a certain toughness to communities that learn to live with it well. Not the cinematic sort of toughness full of shouting and dramatic stares into middle distance. The useful kind. Knowing where to step. Knowing when to cancel a crossing. Knowing that a missing dog near the lower marsh means something different from a missing dog near the market. Knowing which stories are exaggerated and which are quietly true. These are the forms of intelligence that dangerous landscapes produce, and they deserve more respect than modern cultures usually give them. Titanoboa country would create people who understood that technology is helpful, but attention is older and often better at short notice. Even language would keep changing around it. Everyday sayings would form. Someone avoiding a difficult task might be told they were waiting like the bank snake. A person who moved quietly through local politics might be called all reeds and no ripple. Someone reckless might be warned they had the confidence of a goat at the lower crossing, which is really saying a great deal if one has seen what poor judgment looks like in hoofed form. These things sound small, but they matter. They show that the giant has entered not just fear and law, but daily speech. Once that happens, the animal is no longer simply in the ecosystem, it is in the culture's operating system. And when night came, because night always comes in these stories whether one invites it or not, Titanoboa would shape the dark as well. Lights along some paths, doors latched sooner near the wet season, boats tied away from reed margins, livestock counted, children called in. The sort of evening rituals that seem quaint from elsewhere and perfectly sensible from within. The air would still cool, insects would still sing, frogs would still go about their business with unreasonable enthusiasm. But in certain places the darkness would belong a little less to people than they preferred to admit. Not because the snake was out there every night, but because it could be, and that possibility is enough to make even familiar places behave better. There is a strange comfort in honesty like that. A world with Titanoboa in it would be more dangerous in some corners, yes, but it would also be more truthful. It would not let us forget that Earth is not arranged entirely around our habits, that warm water is not neutral, that the edge of a floodplain is not just scenery, that some landscapes must still be negotiated rather than owned in the deepest sense. We might dislike that lesson. We might build fences and drones and management plans around it, but the lesson would remain. So what would it mean to live in a world that still belonged to giants? It would mean learning, again and again, that daily life is not the same as control. It would mean communities shaped by caution rather than fantasy. It would mean politics, science, folklore, tourism and engineering all trying, with varying grace, to keep pace with one old reptile in the reeds. It would mean children raised with better instincts near water. It would mean adults who understood that some silences deserve respect. It would mean a modern world just slightly less smug about having finished the untidy parts of nature. And perhaps, when all of that settled into place, Titanoboa would do something else as well. It would remind us that the living world was never required to become small in order for us to feel at home in it. We simply grew used to calling the remaining vastness remote, exceptional, or extinct. A giant snake in a tropical wetland would challenge that habit every time its body pressed a trail into mud or rolled a dark wake across a channel at dusk, not with a speech, not with a symbol, just with weight. And that may be the real answer to the whole question. If Titanoboa were still alive today, the world would not become fantasy. It would remain stubbornly, administratively, inconveniently real. People would still work, argue, marry, vote, repair roofs, lose keys, file reports, miss boats, and complain about road conditions. They would simply do it on a planet where, in some of the hot low places, one immense old fact still moved through the water without hurry, and the rest of life, including us, had learned to make room for it.